So, I'm once again placed in the awkward position of having to say, it's been a while, hasn't it? Not as much of a while as some of the breaks we've had in the past, but it's been a little while since we were here talking to you folks about the Loch Ness episodes. As you can probably understand, that took a little bit out of us. It really did. We took a little bit of time, a bit of a break, to recover from the amount of work we did for that, and then some personal stuff popped up that I'm not really going to go into here. Most of it was on my end, and it sadly delayed us from recording for a while. I basically just lost any chance of doing extra work during the last month because of that. But we are back. We are back in style, and just in time for the Christmas season. Yes, so some of you folks might remember at the end of our last episode, we heavily implied that we were going to be doing an episode talking about Irish mythology. And that might still be the case coming up in a future episode, but we also promised our patrons that we would do a Christmas episode this year. And just the way things have shaken out, we couldn't really do a Christmas episode in January or February. It had to be December, so we flipped the order of the episodes we're going to be doing. So apologies for that. Instead, we're going to be looking at a particularly jolly figure today on the podcast that I think most people, I'm going to say worldwide, are probably familiar with in some fashion, if only because they know of other countries that have this figure. But before we get into that, we have our first little burst of Holdy Joy coming up. We have a special announcement that we'd like to make for this episode. I'm going to be passing over to my co-host for this, and it's something that's been coming for a long time. I'm really happy that we're finally there. So, I'm now going to pass you over, folks, to my new and/or improved co-host.
Thank you, Charles. Hello, everyone. This is the disembodied voice that was formerly known as Crofty here. So I'd just like to take a moment before we get on with the episode to explain a little change going on here at Mythillogical, namely that I am transgender. Going forward with the show, my voice is going to be a bit different, though bear with me while I get used to recording with it. I am getting rid of the name Crofty. My name is now Cassie, short for Cassandra, and I use she, her. We're not a personality-based podcast, so apart from those two changes, it's not going to be affecting the content of the show at all. Now that I'm out in other parts of my life, I decided it's finally time to make the change on the show.
Yeah.
Some of you might be wondering why, as like I said, I'm a disembodied voice and Crofty is a gender-neutral name, why I don't just continue playing Crofty while we record. But this show's important to me. I've loved making it for the past 4 or more years, and hope we can keep making it for a lot more years to come. And I want to do that as my real self. So this is me. I'm Cassie.
Yeah.
And I just hope that being called Cassandra on a mythology podcast doesn't lead hope that doesn't lead to me suffering from the curse of my Trojan namesake, no relation, and suddenly our listeners never believe a word I say ever again.
Yeah, I hadn't actually made that connection. The Cassandra, what's it called? Cassandra...
I don't know, the prophet from Troy.
Yeah, exactly. The one who is doomed to know the future but not be able to do anything about it or something like that.
No one will believe a word she says.
That was it.
Yeah. That was not...
out mythologied here.
Yeah, that was not actually part of the process of deciding my name. I didn't make that connection for months.
I hadn't until now. No, I'm really happy that you're finally in a place where you're comfortable to do this. I understand it is a big step to come out to what has been a large audience historically for us. So thank you for trusting me as well with it. Now, anyone listening at home as well, I just want to also give you folks a warning. Cassie probably isn't going to be reading that many of your comments from this episode for understandable reasons. I am, however, and I am neither a merciful nor forgiving God. So my edict for anyone who wants to try and cause trouble over this on the YouTube comments or the Spotify comments is fix your hearts or perish. Right, on that cheery note, let's get back to the episode.
Thank you, Charles.
So, on that note then, Cassie, let's get going.
Let's crack on, yes.
Yeah, we had a bit of I'm not going to say a mix-up, we had some varying ideas of how this episode was going to go down. We started off initially talking about doing something that looked at the origins of Christmas, in addition to another popular figure that I'll mention in a second. We did a Patreon vote that was between that figure and Krampus, and that figure won. And I kind of basically went off on one and wrote a big screed about the origins of the Christian holiday. Turned out had nothing to do with the actual episode we were supposed to be writing. So look forward to that possibly being a future episode next year that we're going to do.
Hopefully you've saved yourself some work next year.
Doing so. I might actually finish the script on time and not 10 minutes after the recording starts, like usual. But I think we can now move on, Cassie, and reveal the actual subject of today's podcast, which is suitably Christmassy.
Yes, and that subject is Satan. Santa.
Did an email get misspelled?
Don't worry, I haven't actually written a whole script on Satan.
No, that's 2 years from now. But yes, today's episode is going to be covering Saint Nicholas himself, Chris Christie, etc. And
Chris Christie? Isn't that a politician? Chris Kringle.
Oh God, not Chris. Yeah, Chris Kringle. We're not
very
a political
today.
Yeah. But on that note, Cassie, do you want to, for the ones of people out there who don't know who Santa Claus is, do you want to start by giving us a bit of a brief summary as to who Santa Claus is?
Yes. So Santa Claus is allegedly the person who delivers gifts to children every year at Christmas. Other names for him include Father Christmas, which I think is more common in Britain, also known as Saint Nick or Chris Kringle. He's a jolly old man with a long white beard, usually wearing a red robe and a hat, and known for laughing with the sound of ho ho ho. He's said to live in the North Pole, where he oversees a large number of elves who make toys for children to give to them for Christmas. Santa delivers all of these toys to all the good children of the world on the night of Christmas Eve. And if that seems implausible to you, then go check the NORAD website, where they track him every year.
Yeah, he's very, very good at his job, it turns out.
Yeah. But not sure whether they track him because children enjoy seeing it, or because he is actually a threat. We'll see later.
Yeah. Historically, there's been some reasons to think that.
Yeah. To travel around the world on Christmas Eve, he rides a large sleigh pulled by 8 flying reindeer, which are named Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, and Blitzen. And later there was the addition of a 9th reindeer, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer,
we'll be getting into that,
whose nose shines so bright that it can light up dark and foggy nights. At each house, he enters by climbing down the chimney, despite the fact that he is usually depicted as being quite rotund. And he leaves presents in the children's Christmas stockings that are hung above the fireplace. He knows which children have been good and which children have been naughty, and the bad children instead receive a lump of coal. He's been depicted in all kinds of art, Christmas decorations, books, comics, cartoons, movies. Most shopping malls in America will have a Santa's grotto at Christmas. A lot of them in other countries do as well. I've seen a few in the UK. And there, children can meet a man who is definitely the real Santa.
Yes. For any children listening, that is Santa.
It's the real Santa. It's not an employee in a costume. And you can tell him what you would like for Christmas. Children can also address a letter to Santa at the North Pole, and some post offices will ensure that they receive a reply, or at least they did in the 90s. Maybe not so much today, because people are justifiably more cautious about putting their kid's name and return address on an envelope.
And also, people are there's a lot of people now, and not all of Santa's helpers can get to everyone.
Yeah. He's still trying to catch up with the workload. Yeah. He's doing his best.
Been trying to catch up since the 19th century. He'll get there one day.
We often talk about our introductions to the figures that we're discussing. So as there's obviously so much Santa or Father Christmas in popular culture, I'll just say that as a kid, my personal favourite depiction of Santa was the 1991 animated short film Father Christmas, based on the books by Raymond Briggs, who was also known for writing and illustrating The Snowman, which showed Santa's life around the year between working each Christmas where he went on holiday around the world, which is quite a fun film.
I was about to say that, I saw a film as well that I really loved as a kid, but on Googling it hurriedly in the background to try and remember the name, it's the same film. So, very original there of me, I'm afraid.
Do you remember his song?
No, I don't. I remember very little about it.
Can I give the 90s kids nostalgia with one line of the song? So jump up on my sleigh and we're on our way to another blooming Christmas.
Not quite walking in the air, but it'll do.
Nah. Same people, though. It was sang by Mel Smith, not Aled Jones.
Oh.
And the voice was very different.
Yeah. So, on that note, then, I think we should talk a little bit about what sources that we've used for today's episode.
Sources, in very big air quotes.
Air quotes. To steal a line from the YouTuber Ross Scott on his Game Dungeon series, after reading many of my sources for today's episodes, I was reminded of a line from the film Full Metal Jacket, which is, "You are all equally worthless." That's not actually quite true, but unfortunately, we've discovered that the topic of Christmas and kind of scholastic examinations of Christmas are somewhat wanting. There's a lot of works that just repeat a lot of popular myths, don't really cite any sources for what they're saying, despite sometimes being written by real academic historians as well.
Yeah, academic sources are so thin on the ground that if they were snow, they would not even delay a single English train, and that's saying something.
But anyway, the actual sources that I did end up using, so some of the better ones I'm going to list here. I used the Oxford Handbook of Christmas, which is by various authors and edited by Timothy Larsen. I used Santa Claus, a Biography by Gerry Bowler, Christmas a History by Judith Flanders, Santa Claus Worldwide by Tom A. German. It's spelled German, spelled with a G. So
German with a J.
J, sorry, not a G. So I'm not quite sure how that's supposed to be pronounced. I'm going to go with German. Could be German. I don't know.
German?
German, yeah, possibly. Santa Claus Worldwide is an interesting book. It's simultaneously, I would call the book that sources its claims the best, and also I disagree with some of its claims the most. It's quite good at, actually tracking down individual primary sources that other works reference but don't appear to have actually read. So if you're going to read one source from here that involves more factual, actual citing of sources, go for this one. At the same time, it makes a lot of claims about the pagan history of Christmas that I don't agree with. So just keep that in mind. In addition, I also used a few sections from Medieval Children by Nicholas Orme, The Stations of the Sun, A History of the Ritual Year in Britain by Ronald Hutton, The Christmas Encyclopedia by William D. Crump, Christmas in Germany, A Cultural History by Joe Perry, and The Battle for Christmas, A Cultural History of America's Most Cherished Holiday by Stephen Nissenbaum.
As for my sources, in addition to the Santa Claus Worldwide book, which was quite useful, I made extensive use of Saint Nicholas, A Closer Look at Christmas by Joe L. Wheeler, which documents the life of Saint Nicholas, or Christian belief in the life of Saint Nicholas. Also, the only thing that I think is a primary source in this entire episode, a translation of Simeon the Metaphrast's The Life of Saint Nicholas from the 9th century, and also the Saint Nicholas Centre website, which is a website aimed at educating people on the life of Saint Nicholas and bringing Saint Nicholas back into Christmas. For my later section on other Santa-like figures around the world, that's where sources do get a bit more iffy.
Yeah. I
will at one point be referencing a story in Old Peter's Russian Tales, which you might remember all the way back in our Baba Yaga episode.
Oh, wow. That's episode 4, I believe.
Yeah, there's a few throwbacks there. An article on the website Express to Russia called The Legend of Dead Moroz. The article How Joulupukki, the Finnish Santa, Went from Naughty to Nice by Kathleen Harris on a site called Ink Tank. An article called Season's Bleatings, Finnish Photographs of the Nuutipukki from 1928, which is a collection of public domain photos of Finnish tradition and information behind them. And the BBC article, Does Santa Claus Come from Finland? If I've missed anything from that later section, I will be mentioning it as I go.
Okay, so that's our sources out of the way. How we've split this up is, Cassie, you're going to cover the origins of the saint that Santa Claus is based on, kind of running all the way up until, I'd say, like the beginning of the early medieval period.
I'm then going to have a look at the long gestation of that saint throughout Europe and how he was depicted in various different forms, how the Protestant Reformation reacted to him, not well is the answer, and the development of various related figures as a result, before going on to talk a little bit about the more modern Santa Claus. After that, Cassie, you're going to round us off and talk about Santa Claus on tour worldwide, looking at the various ways that other countries have interpreted and put their own spin on Santa Claus as a figure. Okay. Ironically, the actual episode does not start with Santa Claus really as an entity at all. Instead, we're going to have to go way, way further back than Santa in his modern form when he appears. He's actually a surprisingly recent figure. And for that purpose, Cassie, you're going to start by introducing us to a 4th century saint?
3rd.
3rd century saint. Apologies.
Late 3rd, early 4th.
I was technically correct.
That's kind of correct.
Yeah. Going to introduce you to a saint that probably everyone out there already knows, Saint Nicholas.
Thank you, Charles. Yes, Saint Nicholas is probably the oldest of the names that are associated with the modern Father Christmas. Even with the much more secular version of Christmas that we see today, it is still quite common to know the name of Saint Nicholas as an alternative to Santa, although outside of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, his life and the deeds attributed to him are not as well known as many other famous saints. Joe Wheeler, in his 2005 book, Saint Nicholas, A Closer Look at Christmas, describes the modern Father Christmas as a Protestant Reformation repackaging of Saint Nicholas, but that's to get ahead of ourselves. It's worth noting here that the book I'm using for my main account of Saint Nicholas's life and belief in him does seem to be written by a Christian true believer. The introduction asks questions on whether it's okay to allow children to believe in Santa Claus, the secularized Santa Claus, representing a modern, commercialized Christmas, since that belief is still a benevolent one, even if he is not the real saint. Wheeler does also assert that Saint Nicholas was definitely real, and cites earlier Christian authors in doing so. Obviously, that should be taken with a grain of salt. As with many saints of the time period that we'll be talking about, we don't have much historical evidence to go on. There are no writings attributed to him, or no contemporary chronicles which mention him. His name is on some lists of attendance at a particularly important council, that I'll be mentioning later, but not all of them, and I believe that the lists his name is on aren't from the time of the council. The first church that was named for him was built less than 200 years after he's believed to have died. It was ordered by the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century. To be well established enough in such a short time, I'd say it is likely there was a historical figure who inspired the legends in some way. Last time in our Loch Ness Monster episode, when we discussed the life of St. Columba, we did talk about how Christian sources on saints were not written as historical chronicles, but instead as materials for spreading Christianity through the alleged miracles of the saints. In the case of that episode, we dismissed the writings on St. Columba for that reason as not reliable enough evidence for historical sightings of Nessie. But for our purposes today, Christian sources are the best sources to use since we are talking about the history of belief in St. Nicholas, not necessarily the man himself.
And also we basically have no other sources to go on if we exclude them.
That too, yeah. We have there was this guy on a list named St. Nicholas, but that's about it.
Yeah. Guy named St. Nicholas, Protestants didn't like him, 16th century. That's all we got.
I mean, we're way before Protestantism was even a thing. I don't think Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity had even separated at that point.
No, they hadn't.
Christianity was like one thing at this point. Well, okay, Christianity was like one thing until Nicholas was in his 40s.
I mean, there's been all sorts of strife since the very beginning. It's not even worth getting into it.
Oh, I get into one of the earliest strifes in Christianity. He allegedly had a pretty big role in something very important in separating Christianity later on. St. Nicholas's birth is usually put in the late 3rd century AD, around the decade of the 270s. He was born in the city of Myra in Lycia, located in the southwest of modern-day Turkey. Myra was some 700 years old at the time and an important port on the trade routes between Egypt and Rome. Christianity had been brought to Lycia between 50 and 60 AD by St. Paul the Apostle on his third missionary journey, as mentioned in Acts 21, which states that St. Paul travelled from Rhodes to the nearby port of Patara, and this is when he's believed to have spread the faith into Asia Minor before moving on to Phoenicia. When being transported to Rome to be executed, in Acts 27, St. Paul is again brought to Myra en route. St. Nicholas's ancestors are so believed to have been converted by St. Paul. Nicholas's parents' names vary according to different sources. His mother is either named Johann or Anna, and his father is either named Theophanes or Epiphanes. They had been unable to conceive a child for many years, and so prayed that God would grant them a child. If God granted them a boy child, they promised to dedicate his life to the service of God. God clearly took notice, sending a sign when Nicholas was born that Nicholas was particularly special. When Nicholas was placed in a bath immediately after his birth, he was able to stand by himself. Before he could even speak, he displayed religious knowledge by refusing his mother's milk on Wednesdays and Fridays, which at the time were traditional fasting days, and so, even as a baby, he was known to be favoured by God. At a young age, he was particularly disciplined and devout. Simeon the Metaphrast, in his 9th century chronicle on St. Nicholas's life, describes him as showing abstinence and as a model of good behaviour. He supposedly displayed keen and subtle genius, mastered many disciplines, but rejected political and mercantile.
Yeah, that's the word.
But rejected political and mercantile fields. He avoided befriending anyone he saw as immoral and would not converse with or even look at women, which was described by Simeon as a virtue, but viewing that as a good thing is a bigger problem with the church at the time. It's definitely not how Jesus would have behaved. In the 270s, the Roman Empire was beginning to decline and was being ravaged by plague, which came to Lycia during Nicholas's childhood and claimed the lives of both of his parents. His uncle, who was a bishop, took him in and saw to his upbringing and mentoring, and Nicholas thrived in the church. Even at this young age, he was said to be generous and deeply concerned for others. His parents had left him significant wealth, and Nicholas vowed to give away all of this wealth to those in need, secretly and in the name of Christ. In one of the most famous stories of his generosity, by the standards of the time, as I have opinions on this, Saint Nicholas saved the daughters of a man who had lost his fortune and was unable to pay their dowries. At the time, a man would only marry a woman if his prospective bride's father would pay him a dowry. Nicholas's neighbour had 3 daughters, each with a prospective suitor, but having recently lost his fortune, could only afford to marry one of them off. This he considered a fate worse than death for the other 2. He prayed to God to save his daughters from such an awful fate, but had to take matters into his own hands. He decided to provide for his younger 2 daughters and would have to sell his eldest into slavery.
Oof.
Yeah, not good.
No, I have seen like versions where, I don't know if they tried to sanitize it, but the way they tried to sanitize it was also bad, where they're like, he's going to sell them into sex work instead.
You know the good place movie? That's worse. You understand how that's worse?
Yeah. Like obviously no shame to people who do sex work, but like
selling people into
forcefully
it.
making someone do it. Real bad. Real bad.
So I don't think it gets worse from here. I think this is the first time I can say it doesn't get worse.
Yeah.
Like normally it's like, oh, it gets worse, but not today, don't worry. Unless I've forgotten something. So when word spread that the father was planning to do this, Nicholas chose to act. His solution was to sneak up to their house at night and drop a bag of gold through the window. There are supposedly 2 alternatives to this, which will be our first 2 hints at Christmas traditions in the stories of St. Nick. One is that instead of reaching in and dropping the bag of gold sneakily, He threw the bag of gold through the window, and it landed in a stocking that was drying over the fire. The other is that instead of dropping the bag of gold through the window, Nicholas dropped the gold down the chimney. The next morning, the family found the gold wherever it landed, and were overjoyed, thanking God for this miracle. And so, the eldest daughter's dowry was paid, and she was married off, with the father and her sisters having enough to live on for quite some time. Nicholas kept an eye on the family as the money began to run out, and when they needed it the most, he dropped a second bag of gold through the window. Once again, God was praised for this miracle, and the next daughter was married off, and the father and the youngest daughter were able to live on the remaining money. This time, the money lasted longer, and the father did not believe that a third miracle could happen. However, as the money began to run out, he would stay awake each night, believing that there must be a person acting on God's will, delivering them from poverty each time, and hoping that he could see this person and thank them.
Oh, so there have been skeptics in Santa Claus since the very beginning then.
Yeah, even though this time it actually was Santa Claus. Yeah. One night he fell asleep, during which time Nicholas dropped one final bag of gold through the window. However, Nicholas was not as stealthy as he hoped, and the man woke up and caught him in the act, thanking him profusely and kissing his feet. Nicholas raised the man up and told him that God alone should be thanked for the gold, and made him vow never to tell where the gold came from while Nicholas lived. And so the story was not told until after Nicholas's death, presumably by one of the daughters. The story has also influenced depictions of Saint Nicholas in art, where a representation of the 3 bags of gold is used to denote that a figure is Saint Nicholas. Rather than bags, this is shown by Saint Nicholas holding 3 golden balls. And from the people who brought you Big Chest, this episode is sponsored by Golden Balls.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is time for an ad break, but I had to let that one in.
Yeah, it's a good thing you remembered ad breaks, because I wasn't remembering ad breaks. Go buy some big golden balls, I guess. I'm going to get sued by that daytime TV show at this rate.
Or by the anime Dandadan, which I'm watching, which has something about that.
Okay. I still haven't seen it. Please no spoilies. Yeah. Here's some adverts. And we are back.
And we're picking up the story of Saint Nicholas. This particular story was usually placed earlier in the timeline than Saint Nicholas being ordained as a priest. Modern sources say that he's thought to have been inducted by his uncle, who at the time was an abbot, and he was first inducted as a deacon, then a full priest. He remained living in the church, in quite Spartan quarters, sleeping on the floor and only eating 1 small meal a day. Nicholas would quite soon become ordained as the Bishop of Myra, sometime around the year 300. The previous bishop had passed suddenly and without a successor. God sent a vision to the priests of Nicholas's arrival, telling him that he was to be appointed as the new bishop. When Nicholas arrived at the church and was asked who he was, he said that his name was Nicholas the Sinner, and by his humility, the other priests knew him as the one whom God had sent. Soon after his appointment, he and the rest of the church were forced into exile due to the ascension of the Eastern Roman Emperor Galerius, who instated a purge of Christianity in Asia Minor in 303. I can't find any information on any of Nicholas's deeds in exile at the time. The next information we have is that he was able to return to Lycia around 313. Emperor Galerius had died in 311, and the Western Roman Emperor Constantine the Great had issued the Edict of Milan, officially ending the persecution of Christians in the empire and granting religious freedom.
I believe Galerius also issued an edict in 311, but anyway.
Yeah, the
Edict of Toleration, I think it was called.
Yeah, he formally ended persecution, but it wasn't until the Edict of Milan that it was fully enshrined in Roman law, right. I think. I think his edict was just, maybe stop doing all that persecution that I've been promoting for now, rather than it's illegal. So Christians now were free to practice their faith openly, and so they began to bring the word of God to those who still followed the Greco-Roman religion. with Artemis or Diana being the most prominent of the pantheon in Lycia. In a section that I'm going to call Santa Smash, Nicholas was particularly zealous in ending the worship of Artemis in Lycia. Simeon describes him as setting out with force and holy zeal to rage through the whole infested region, when undertaking his mission to eradicate all idols and shrines to Artemis. Any shrine he discovered, he would tear down and reduce to dust, which Simeon describes as driving away the mass of demons and bringing tranquility to the people in Lycia. Finally, he attacked the largest temple of Artemis in Myra, which Simeon described as remarkably beautiful and unsurpassed in magnitude, but as a most felicitous resort for demons. His attack was described as vigorous and devastating, hurling its towers down to the earth and uprooting the very foundations. Or again, to quote Simeon, "Indeed, what was the highest at the very pinnacle of the temple was embedded in the earth, and what was in the earth was impelled into the air." This attack finally brought an end to the worship of Artemis in Lycia. Nicholas's next two miracles can be placed in the year 325, as they occurred at a major historical event, the First Council of Nicaea. To provide some context, we go back to Emperor Constantine. In 324, Constantine had chosen to move his capital from Rome to Byzantium in the east, and would later rename it Constantinople.
Yeah, modern day Istanbul.
Constantine had not officially converted to Christianity at this point, but as Christianity had spread throughout the empire, he did favour it above other religions, and the move made political sense to consolidate power through maintaining favour with the church. There were a lot of other reasons too, but that's a discussion far beyond the scope of this episode. Yeah. The newfound favour of the church with the emperor, however, disrupted the unity of the relatively young religion. As Joe Wheeler explains, the church remained pure when their adherents were suffering and dying for their faith, but when they gained political favour, various sects began to fall to the temptations of the material world that political power can bring. Of the various groups that splintered from Christianity here, the most problematic was led by a priest from Alexandria named Arius. Arius challenged one of the most fundamental concepts of Christianity itself, the Holy Trinity, claiming that Christ the Son was not co-equal with God the Father, but was instead the first and greatest among his mortal creations. This, to appropriate a quote from Douglas Adams, made a lot of people very angry, and was widely regarded as a bad move.
I'm working on a video in which I also stole that joke. I'm going to look like a complete hack now. Oh well.
Totally didn't plan that. Before long, the church infighting that Arius had triggered came to the attention of the emperor, and he resolved to do something about it before it could destabilize his new seat of power. So, in 325, he ordered the assembly of the largest council of bishops that the world had seen at the time, the Council of Nicaea, which is now the city of Iznik in northwestern Turkey. According to one account from the Athenian monk Damaskinos, 318 bishops were in attendance, including such prominent members as the Bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Jerusalem, and the Bishop of Alexandria, as well as many lower-ranked bishops who were expected to succeed these titles. On the very first day of the council, the 20th of May, Arius was permitted to make his case, and I'll quote the words of Damaskinos himself to describe Nicholas's reaction. The emperor was sitting on his throne, flanked by 159 bishops to his left and 159 bishops to his right. Arius was presenting his views with great vigour and detail. As Saint Nicholas observed the scene, the bishops listened to Arius in complete silence and without interrupting this discourse. Outraged and prompted by his saintly vigour, he left his seat and walked up to Arius, faced him squarely, and slapped his face.
That's not very marketplace of ideas, is it?
No. Nicholas was definitely getting a lump of coal that Christmas. This was, of course, not well received by the assembled clergy, who petitioned the emperor for Nicholas to be punished for the assault. The emperor stated, "Indeed, there is a law which forbids anyone to lift his hand in violence in the presence of the emperor, and it specifies his hand be cut off. However, it is not up to me in this assembly to act upon it. Instead, your holinesses, you should make the decision in this case, and I leave it to your judgment whether and how this act is to be punished. The bishops judged that Nicholas was to be stripped of his clerical robes, shackled, and thrown in the dungeons for the duration of the council, and a final judgment made after the council had concluded. And so, Nicholas was confined, naked and in chains, in a bare cell. There, however, a miracle occurred. That night, he was visited by Jesus and Mary. They asked him, "Nicholas, why are you imprisoned?" Nicholas responded, "Because of my love for you." And so Jesus freed him of his chains and gave him a volume of the Holy Scripture. Mary brought him his bishop's robe to return his dignity, and Nicholas studied the Scripture all night. The next morning, when a jailer was bringing bread and water, he saw Nicholas clothed and no longer chained, calmly reading Scripture. Upon learning of this, the emperor ordered Nicholas freed, asked his forgiveness, and had him attend the council again. Joe Wheeler states after telling of this miracle, "It appears probably that the original account has been embellished. Far be it from me to question miracles, but I suspect so too." Wheeler thinks that Constantine himself may have added the appearance of Jesus and Mary to the story to justify his own choice to release Nicholas, and that he chose to do so because, secretly, he was aware that Nicholas's view, and those who agreed with him, was a more favourable view to him politically, if the church were to maintain that position. While he had to be seen to punish Nicholas, a visit from Jesus himself gave him a literal get-out-of-jail-free card with the clergy, supported by his position as emperor guaranteeing that no one would dare question his honesty. There are multiple other accounts of the Council of Nicaea, giving a varying number of bishops and many not mentioning Nicholas at all. There are multiple lists of attendees of the council, of which only 6 include Nicholas. So the account may be embellished even more than Wheeler believes by adding the story of Nicholas's involvement entirely. According to Wheeler, the slap and the visitation from Jesus was the last major involvement in the council by Nicholas. According to the Saint Nicholas Centre, a legend from the 1500s tells that Nicholas did play another defining role, producing a second miracle in order to demonstrate to Arius' followers how the 3 aspects of the Holy Trinity can exist as one being. To do so, Nicholas presented before the council a brick, and stated that while it was made of earth, water, and fire, it was one brick, not 3, just as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are one God. Holding up the brick, it spontaneously burst into flame, and drops of water fell to the ground. The remnants of the brick crumbled into dry dust, thus demonstrating all 3 elements and proving the righteousness of Nicholas's argument, that God is 3 aspects in one being. Whatever Nicholas's true involvement, if any, the council continued for 2 months of debate. Constantine would not call an end without a final decision from the bishops as to the official position of the church. Eventually, Arius and a small group who remained supporting him were condemned by the assembled clergy. A statement, signed by all but 2 of the bishops, was issued, which read, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible or invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God begotten, not made, being one essence with the Father, who for us men and our salvation came down and was made flesh, was made man, suffered, rose again the 3rd day, ascended into heaven, and comes to judge the quick and the dead." Now, you might think that the slap is very out of character for the modern day idea of Santa, and you'd be right. But there has been an attempt to actually bring it back and incorporate it into the modern Santa Claus by one Jean Edward Veith, the provost of the Patrick Henry Conservative Christian College in Virginia in 2005, who wrote the article, "Slappy Holiday. Why not take the Santa Claus tradition a little further?"
Oh, a horrible title.
Yeah. If we're laughing at this, it's laughing at how awful it is.
Yeah.
It is an article on a fairly common theme that modern Christmas has become too secular and forgotten the importance of our Lord and Saviour, replacing Jesus with the modern secular Santa.
Yeah. Spoiler for next year's, if it happens, Origins of Christmas episode.
There have literally been people complaining that people don't treat Christmas with enough religious reverence since it first widely became observed. Like, there's literally accounts of people in the late 4th century being like, why are you all feasting so much?
Some things never change, huh?
Mm.
This particular article, though, has an interesting addition to that very old argument by proposing to bring back the slap aspect of Saint Nicholas's story into the modern Santa canon, saying the original Santa Claus was someone who flew off the handle when he heard someone minimizing Christ. Perhaps we can battle our culture's increasingly Christless Christmas by enlisting Santa in his original cause. The poor girl's stockings have become part of our Christmas imagery. So should the Saint Nicholas slap.
Agreed to disagree.
Yeah, the one time I'll say it gets worse, this episode, actually. He at first says this should be a gentle, admonishing slap to those in the church who deny its teachings and take Christ out of Christmas. He then goes further than this claim, as his plan to tweak the mythology of Santa is that when Santa has compiled his naughty list, on entering the house of children who think they can do without Christ, instead of leaving them cold, he should slap them awake.
Okay.
He then even further goes against this, goes against his first claim to limit its people in the church. He lists others deserving of a slap as teachers who forbid the singing of religious carols, office managers who put up holiday trees, judges who outlaw nativity displays, people who give the Da Vinci Code.
Christmas.
People who give the Da Vinci Code as a Christmas present. Each of
To be fair, I'm on board with that one.
I've never read it.
It's awful. It's fun, but awful.
I saw Angels and Demons at the cinema, but I'd not read Da Vinci Code.
I've read the Angels and Demons. I've not seen the film, so I don't have any comments on it.
I don't even remember it much anymore. It was so long ago. Yeah, he punctuated each of these people with slap in capital letters with an exclamation mark. Not a fan of this extreme take. Violent Santa should stick to Futurama.
Yes. That's one aspect, though, I do hope in the future, like in 100 years' time, someone's misunderstood Futurama and suddenly that is Santa. Like,
yes.
That's how he's remembered.
Yeah, we need to promote this version of Santa just to confuse historians in the future. Please. Moving back to St. Nicholas himself, he would be associated with Emperor Constantine for the remainder of the emperor's life. The oldest written story of Nicholas, which is the only surviving chapter from an unknown Greek author's 4th century, The Life of Nicholas, would take place sometime after the Council of Nicaea and is known in various versions as the 3 generals, the 3 princes, or the 3 innocent men. During a revolt against imperial rule in Phrygia in western Anatolia, 3 generals named Nepotianus, Ursus, and Eupolionus were dispatched to restore order. On their journey to Phrygia, they made a stop in Myra to resupply. Soldiers were sent ashore to procure supplies. However, these soldiers began fighting with the local traders, looting and destroying homes and shops, while the generals remained aboard ship and were unaware of events. Bishop Nicholas, receiving word of the soldiers' actions, set out immediately to the harbour and stormed aboard the general's ship, demanding to know under what authority the soldiers were raiding the town. The generals denied any knowledge, and Nicholas forced them to come ashore and see the destruction for themselves. At Nicholas's urging, the generals brought their troops under control, having men imprisoned and flogged as punishment. As the townsfolk, Nicholas's congregation, and the more disciplined soldiers set to work repairing the damage, Nicholas gave the generals hospitality at the cathedral, and at their request, performed a blessing on them and their mission. As the generals were about to take their leave of Nicholas, word reached him that the provincial prefect, a man named Eustathios, who was known for being extremely corrupt, had arrested 3 innocent people and was to have them summarily executed in the centre of town. Nicholas hurried to the town square and wrestled the sword from the executioner's hand for cutting the innocent men free. An important detail here is that at no point was Nicholas informed of what their alleged crime was or how anyone knew they were innocent. Nicholas simply knew these things. That is important.
Makes sense in line with him being a saintly figure.
Yeah, and an important development for Santa. In fact, after he'd cut the men free, Nicholas sought out Prefect Eustathios, who had seen the commotion and ridden to the square. Nicholas informed him that he was putting an end to his corrupt rule of the city, and would personally inform the emperor of his actions, with the 3 generals as witnesses. Eustathios fell to his knees to confess his sins to the bishop and beg forgiveness, which Nicholas granted him. The 3 generals, after their ship had been resupplied, continued on to Phrygia and were successful in putting down the rebellion. Emperor Constantine rewarded them with riches and promotions. This inspired envy among rival generals, which led to many of them making false accusations that the generals had supported the revolt in order to claim rulership of Phrygia themselves. They petitioned the imperial chancellor, Evlavios, to investigate, bribing him with large sums of money. Evlavios accepted the bribes and attempted to delay by sending several investigators to Phrygia, but would eventually back himself into a corner. He could not find the generals innocent without it being revealed that he'd accepted a bribe, and so the generals' rivals urged him to put them to death. Emperor Constantine accepted Evlavios' judgment and ordered them arrested and executed the following day. The generals prayed all night, begging God to send Saint Nicholas to save them, as he had saved the 3 innocent men in Myra. Shortly before dawn, Emperor Constantine dreamed that Nicholas stood before him and said to him, "Arise, Emperor, quickly. You must free the 3 innocent men whom you have condemned to death. If you do not free them, God will involve you in a war that will cause your death." Constantine, not recognizing the bishop, demanded, "Who are you to threaten me, and how do you enter my palace in the middle of the night?" Nicholas replied, "I am the Bishop of Myra, and God has sent me to tell you to free these men without delay." Nicholas would also appear in the dreams of Evlavios, admonishing him for lowering himself and his office to such a level, and telling him that God will kill him if he does not free the men and give up the bribe money. Constantine and Evlavios conferred together and summoned the generals. Constantine asked them how they had sent such apparitions, telling them not to be afraid, he was their friend as well as their emperor. They told the emperor the story of Nicholas knowing the innocence of the 3 men in Myra, and how they prayed that he would intervene and prove their own innocence to the emperor. The emperor pronounced them free. He gave them a gold-covered Bible manuscript, a gold incense vessel, and 2 gold-plated candlesticks, with instructions to deliver them to Bishop Nicholas with the message that the emperor had obeyed him and to send no more divine threats. Joe Wheeler phrases this as to please not threaten him anymore. But that doesn't sound very imperial.
No. Need someone to punch it up for him. Yeah.
Upon delivering the message, the 3 bowed before Nicholas, offering him their gratitude. But, like with the 3 daughters, Nicholas insisted that they should only be grateful to God, not to him. The generals resigned their posts and became monks, dedicating their lives to God. So Joe Wheeler describes this particular story as a precursor to the belief in Santa's knowledge of who is naughty or nice, citing how in each case, Nicholas knew without having to hear any evidence or even having any connection with events who was innocent and who should be saved and who was corrupt and who should be punished.
That does make sense in its attributes that both characters have. I've not heard of any later account that is moving into more into the modern figure of Santa Claus actually try and make that connection.
Yeah.
So it's plausible, but it doesn't sound like there is any direct evidence for it.
Yeah, it feels a bit more like post hoc logic.
Yeah.
In that a saint having this level of sort of omniscience, understanding innocence and guilt, is kind of fitting for a saint. And then when you have the Santa knowing who's good and bad thing, fitting them together rather than a direct descent.
Yeah, it does fit together. It's one of those where it's really tempting to say these are related, but we just don't have anything to actually bridge that gap.
Yeah. Again, Joe Wheeler is a true believer in that sense, so it makes sense he'd put it that way, and it's an interesting argument.
Yeah.
And one that I felt was worth mentioning, even if we're not entirely convinced. For the remainder of his life, Nicholas served the people of Myra diligently, including such acts as convincing Constantine to give Myra tax relief and performing the Christ-like feat of ending a famine by miraculously multiplying the food that had been donated to them by passing traders. And he was revered long after his death for his generous deeds. Nicholas died in the year 343. On his deathbed, he is said to have recited Psalm 30 and 31, In te Domine sperari, and his last breath left him after reciting the line, In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. He was born to the cathedral, where he had served God his entire life, and entombed there, where it is said that a fountain of manna, or pure water from a saint's tomb, flowed. We don't really have any information on his official canonization. I don't think the process of canonization officially was finalized at that point. We know that by the 5th century he was considered a saint and venerated as such. In the 11th century, after Asia Minor had been conquered by the Saracens, his tomb was being preserved by a small community of monks. However, the church in Bari, in southeastern Italy, which particularly venerated Saint Nicholas, made the decision to reclaim the saint's body and his relics. 47 men voyaged to the port of Andriaci in 1087, making their way to the church in Myra, where they broke into the tomb, successfully stealing the relics, and returned to Bari. The Basilica di San Nicola was built, and Nicholas became the patron saint of Bari, with his tomb now a pilgrimage site. As well as patron saint of Bari, Nicholas holds patronage over several groups, holding, I think, the most patronages of any single saint. He is most widely known as the patron saint of children. There are several stories of kidnapped or lost children around the world who were delivered to safety through the intervention of Saint Nicholas. He is also known as the patron saint of prisoners, particularly the falsely imprisoned, appearing to spare the lives of those who are wrongfully accused.
Give an example of the children, like being a patron saint of children. I didn't really go into this, but I thought I'd mention it now. In the medieval period, there is like a legend of him finding the bodies of 3 children who've been murdered in a barrel, and him miraculously resurrecting them from the dead. Which I think is kind of the medieval equivalent of the 3 innocents.
Yeah, there are a lot of themes of 3 around Nicholas, possibly related to the fact...
Holy Trinity.
Yeah, I think it's very much to support the idea of him being the one who supported the argument for the Holy Trinity against Arius' views. As well as these 2, he is also the patron saint of young women seeking marriage, probably because of the story of the dowerless maidens. Yeah. Young women who wished to find a husband would go to his church in Bari on his feast day, the 6th of December. Sadly, not the day we recorded, we're 2 days late.
That annoyed me when I was like, we could have done it on the day. Oh, wow.
If only I didn't have a day job on Friday. Yeah. And again, in the 3 theme, these young women would place 3 coins in a box to receive his blessing in finding a husband. With that, I think it's time to move on from the life of St. Nicholas, and I will hand over to you, Charles, to continue the story of the development of Santa.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. So yes, we're going to move on from the life of St. Nicholas to the lives of something that is far greater and more powerful than a religious figure, the lives of the listeners, which are about to be enriched by all these adverts that they're going to listen to. So listen twice in that sentence. Oh well. Here's some adverts. Okay, so we are back. Okay, thank you, Cassie, then for giving us that introduction to St. Nicholas. After the end of the Roman period and during the early medieval period, the cult of St. Nicholas gradually spread throughout Western and Northern Europe, a process which may have intensified after the moving of his relics from Myra to Bari in the 11th century. During this time, he came to be seen as a patron saint of a much wider variety of groups than you covered there. It really gets to the point where, like, Gerry Bowler in his book had a list of all the groups that he's supposed to be the patron saint of, and I feel like it could be more accurately summarized as everyone, basically.
Quicker to list who he isn't patron saint of.
Possibly, yes. So these include Aberdonians, apothecaries, not Australians, haven't been founded yet. Austrians, bakers, barrel makers, Belgians, boatmen, bootblacks, brewers, brides, butchers, button makers, captive, chandlers, coopers, dock workers, druggists, Dutchmen, firemen, fishermen, florists, folk falsely accused, Greeks, grooms, haberdashers, judges, Liverpudlians, longshoremen, merchants, murderers, newlyweds, notaries, old maids, orphans, parish clerks, paupers, pawnbrokers, perfumers, pharmacists, pilgrims, pirates, poets, ragpickers, Russians, sailors, sealers, shipwrights, Sicilians, spy stealers, thieves, travellers, and weavers.
Tinkers, tailors, soldiers, and spies.
Yes. Sadly, you know who's not on that list?
No.
Podcasters.
Petition to get Saint Nicholas to be our patron
Yes.
saint.
I'm going to say that he is now the patron saint of podcasters. Because I think that's how everything else was decided.
Yeah, I don't know how you decide what their saints are.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we can do it.
Speaking of deciding, exactly when Nicholas was actually canonized as a saint, that's something I can't determine in my research. I think you struggled as well, Cassie.
Not just me who's had difficulty there, then.
Yeah. According to the incredibly reputable book Canadian Christmas Traditions by D. Anne Mandrick, which I'm not saying just to insult Canadians or anything stupid like that. I'm saying because it didn't source a lot of its claims. Claims that he was recognized by the Eastern Church as a saint by the 9th century. And I also saw claims on random websites that he was canonized by Pope Eugene IV in 1446. Again, something I can't verify. I've also seen a whole bunch of different websites claiming that no one is sure exactly when he was canonized, and that he may merely have been kind of widely and informally judged a saint prior to the process of canonization becoming this really formalized thing that eventually only became a prerogative of the Pope. The problem with all of those claims, though, is that basically none of them provide any convincing sources, so who knows, basically, is the answer. Either way, by the time the major legends regarding Nicholas appear and are circulating throughout Europe, he already seems to have been judged a saint. According to both Gerry Bowler and D. Anne Mandrick, St. Nicholas's association with the practice of gift-giving was something that didn't begin until the 12th century. Going by their accounts, the practice was originally sparked by nuns in both Belgium and France, who decided to mark the date of his death on December 6th by secretly leaving presents at the houses of poor children, who they then attributed to the saint. From this lowly beginning, this custom then apparently spread throughout Western and Central Europe in succeeding centuries. The problem with this claim is, again, I can't find any sort of academic source or account that backs it up. So maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. By the 13th century, many of the legends associated with him would be compiled into what's known as the Golden Legend, which is a compilation of many hagiographic lives of saints that was produced by Archbishop of Genoa, Jacobus de Voragine. From these tales, which include the story of the 3 dowries, his miraculous appearance to save a group of sailors, which I don't think you mentioned, actually.
I cut that part because that was actually a different Saint Nicholas.
Right.
That was a 9th century Saint Nicholas, but no, a 6th century Saint Nicholas. Simeon the Metaphrast in the 9th century misattributed it to Nicholas of Myra.
Wow.
It was only like a few hundred years ago that someone realised the mistake.
Yeah.
By which time it had become a pretty well-known part of the Saint Nicholas story.
Yeah.
So yeah, I cut that for time because it was less relevant, but now you know.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, so from these tales, which include the story of the 3 dowries, miraculous appearance to save a group of sailors, and his campaign of destruction against pagan idols.
Santa smash.
Yeah. Although I think this version, it's gone from being a temple of Artemis/Diana to being a holy tree. Either way, it's clear that his role as a gift giver and a pious figure who interceded on behalf of the poor and those in need was well established by this time. There are also claims floating around out there that the gift-giving guise of St. Nicholas has pre-existing pagan roots. In particular, I've seen attempts to link this aspect of his character with the god Woden, also known as Wotan, or more familiarly, Odin. For example, in his work Santa Claus Worldwide, Tom German writes that, quote, St. Nicholas was drafted by Catholic missionaries in the High Middle Ages to replace the pagan god Odin and give a Christian purpose to the midwinter celebration of Yule. As we discussed briefly in our Wild Hunt episode and others, in North and Germanic mythology, Odin is usually presented as the father of the gods and the king of the Aesir, so I'm just giving a refresh for anyone who's forgotten, or if you're new to this episode. In some of his physical aspects, he does superficially resemble Santa Claus, often being depicted as a bearded old man wearing a hat and cloak who leans on a staff, who often wanders alone, and sometimes does fly through the air on the back of his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir. The problem is these claims often specifically frame Odin as a pre-Christian gift-giving figure in association with his role as the erstwhile leader of the Wild Hunt. Now, if you watched our episode that we did quite a while back now on the Wild Hunt, you'll know that we're quite dubious of the idea that a single kind of unified folkloric wild hunt was widespread throughout Europe or even throughout most of Germany prior to the compilation that Jacob Grimm made, various traditions. Jacob Grimm of the famous Brothers Grimm. As we demonstrated in that episode, where Odin was chronicled as the leader of the wild hunt, these appearances are far more limited in scope, and the idea of Odin as a huntsman appears to be a development that is only chronicled from the 16th century onwards, which is much later than the time I'm talking about, and that St. Nicholas would be making his way into Europe. To me, this all doesn't really fit with the idea that Odin performed a gift-giving role throughout wider parts of Europe prior to the popularization of St. Nicholas. There have also been attempts, though, to link Odin to this gift-giving tradition through his known role in the festival of Yule. I think this is an argument that is on slightly steadier ground. I think there's more to go on here, as we do have a small number of Norse sagas that associate him in some way with that festival. According to the saga of King Hakon the Good, contained within the, I'm going to get this wildly wrong pronunciation, Heimskringla, but according to this saga, Yule was a pre-Christian sacrifice festival that began on December 14th and was held for 3 days after. Later, it was eventually Christianized, and its date was made the same as Christmas. This festival might also be attested by Snorri Sturluson in the Ynglinga saga. Is that how it's pronounced?
Ynglinga, yeah.
Who mentions midwinter as one of the main times of sacrifice. At this festival, all kinds of cattle and horses were sacrificed, then their blood was collected and sprinkled across temple altars and worshippers. The animal's flesh was then boiled into a savoury meat in kettles over the fire, and full goblets were passed over it. The first of these goblets was Odin's, and it was emptied in order to give victory and power to the chief who held the feast. According to Rudolf Simek Dictionary of Northern Mythology, Yolnir was also known as one of Odin's names, which likely referred to the practice of Yuletide. There are various other mentions as well that I've not gone into entirely, so there's mentions that are claimed to be associated with this festival in the 7th/8th century English writer Bede, for example. I think he names one of the old Anglo-Saxon months as having a name that sounds suspiciously like Yule. My point here is that this all sounds like a plausible enough connection between Odin and Christmas via Yule, if not with Saint Nicholas. We also know that Yule was a common word for the Christmas celebration in England during early Anglo-Saxon times. So, yeah, this festival probably did exist and it probably did involve Odin. But there's also plenty of other later Christmas-esque customs associated with the Yule. So we've got the Yule goat, we've got the Yule log, and the Yule boar, amongst others. It's just that none of these appear in the older Scandinavian sources that actually mention this festival. The other big problem we have, though, is the same that we have with all the Icelandic sagas, which is that all the ones I cited here were written down based on oral memories in the 13th century, long after Yule had effectively been Christianized. So we ultimately don't know just how much of these retellings are accurate descriptions of pagan practices and not merely later Christian interpretations of these practices. You've got a similar problem going on over in Ireland with a lot of Irish mythology, which we'll be talking about relatively soon. What's also a big problem is I couldn't really find anywhere the idea that Odin was in any form a gift giver in the way that Saint Nicholas was, even in the claimed guise of him being in the wild hunt. I have seen some stuff about him, like offerings made to him for a good harvest, but that's a slightly different animal. My personal conclusion to all this is I'm not going to rule out the idea that some properties of Odin could have been transferred to the medieval Saint Nicholas. It's just I can't find any convincing arguments of how any of this could have taken place. There is one direct pagan association with St. Nicholas that I do know of, which you mentioned, Cassie, which is the tale of Nicholas destroying Artemis's tree. Interestingly, in the Golden Legend version of the tale, this figure, as I mentioned, is given as her Roman counterpart of Diana, which is more relevant here. I bring this up because if you remember in our Wild Hunt episode, from the 9th century, and particularly in the 12th and 13th century, Diana was also sometimes named as one of the leaders of the Women's Host, which is a folkloric group that's often been linked to the supposed wider Wild Hunt myth. The traditions around this host do have some links to the ideas of gift-giving. specifically that this host would bless households that left food out for them, whilst abandoning those that did not to misfortune. I would, however, hesitate to link any of this to the Roman and Greek gods Artemis and Diana, however, given that in St. Nicholas's story, the entity named Diana is just treated pretty much as a guise for the Christian devil, rather than some sort of pagan entity. In the early modern period, St. Nicholas's cult and role as a gift giver seems to have spread widely. To perform his deeds, it was said that he typically entered through either a window or came down the chimney, even if the window was locked, and would leave presents such as nuts, lemons, apples, and pears in children's shoes, caps, petticoats, and stockings. Alongside this, St. Nicholas also seems to have taken on a sterner role, acting as someone who rewarded good children and who also punished those who misbehaved. This secondary role is already described as he showed in his earliest legends. The Golden Legend, for example, claims that, quote, he prayed through the night, mortified his body, and avoided the company of women. He was humble in respecting others, he was effective in speech, animated in giving advice, severe in correcting errors. As you've also previously described, Cassie, he was also still the same saint who in his contention with Artemis was happy to whip non-believers, and a misbehaving child might well find a switch in their shoe instead of a treat. Beyond Nicholas himself, there also appears to have been other customs associated with his name during this period. One example is the practice of Saint Nicholas markets that appeared in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, which provided new opportunities for seasonal treats and toys to be bought and sold. According to the book Medieval Children by Nicholas Orme, in England, St. Nicholas's Day also saw the practice of electing a boy bishop, and going by later Protestant condemnations, it seems that this practice was also known of in continental Europe. In a ceremony similar to the Lord of Misrule celebrations that were sometimes associated with Christmas celebrations at times during medieval Europe, again, something we'll discuss in a future episode, a boy would be chosen amongst those who attended church, who would then travel the neighbourhood, giving blessings and receiving gifts. Later in the month, the same boy would reappear in the church and take part in the liturgy. At Salisbury Cathedral, for example, he was formally installed in the choir at Vespers on the afternoon of the 27th, and would continue to lead services and grant blessings until the next day. In the 14th century, a similar boy bishop would also preach a sermon at St. Paul's, and we have surviving Tudor examples of sermons given by these figures both at St. Paul's and Gloucester Cathedral. I think it goes without saying these speeches and sermons were written for the boy. But you know what wasn't written for... I'm not sure where I'm going with this ad transition.
This ad transition was not written at all.
Yes, as it's becoming painfully clear. Go enjoy some seasonal themed products, everybody.
Ho, ho, ho.
And with that, our adverts have come to an end. And alas, all good things must also come to an end. That's because in the 16th century, the Reformation would break out, and the new Protestant faith would take a dim view of the widespread veneration of saints under Catholicism. My understanding of this, I haven't written it down, but my understanding of this is that what really rankled a lot of Protestant reformers was the idea that saints were individuals who were higher than others within heaven and within the consideration of God, and this kind of went against their kind of idea of all being equal before God's judgment.
Idolatry is bad, according to the Bible, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, basically, a lot of them saw it as being quite close to pagan worship of like polytheism or demigods and figures like that. In states across Europe where Protestantism came to hold sway, these figures increasingly began to be condemned, and Saint Nicholas was no exception. In England in 1541, Henry VIII would ban childish superstitions associated with St. Nicholas's Day and other saints' days by royal proclamation. This proclamation listed amongst these superstitions, quote, children being apparelled to counterfeit priests, bishops, and women, and so led with songs and dances from house to house, blessing the people and gathering money, and boys singing mass and preaching in the pulpit, rather to the derision than to any true glory of God. According to Gerry, veneration of St. Nicholas in England also ended during the reign of the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, although I couldn't find much more in the way of sources regarding that. In 1553, Thomas, now Georgius, or Kirschmeyer is his other possible name, would condemn all gift-giving, the electing of child bishops, and saints' names in general. In 1570, Calvinist Wolich Suwitz might be his actual name, would demand the renaming of the Strasbourg Nicholas market, declaring that, quote, "It is a foolish and pointless custom to fill children's shoes with all sorts of sweets and nonsense. What else is this but sacrifice to an idol? Those who do it do not seem to understand what true religion is." Throughout the Dutch Republic, the celebration of St. Nicholas and his markets was similarly proscribed, and Gerry Bowler claims that Amsterdam even melted down its statue of the saint to help pay for the ongoing war with Spain. Again, I can't find any external sources to verify this. In many places, of course, Protestant reformers went much further than simply picking fights with saints, and in Scotland, several Swiss cities, and in England between 1645 to 1660, Christmas itself was banned altogether. In England, this decision is often attributed to Oliver Cromwell. My belief is that it's something which happened alongside him, but I don't think he directly instigated. Most significantly for our future discussions of Santa, Christmas was also banned in Puritan New England, which may have had some effect on the figure's later evolution. Despite all these proscriptions, there was resistance of a form. With the image of St. Nicholas proscribed in many places, other figures would rise to take over many of his duties. The first of these replacements was a suitably Christian one, the figure of the Christkindl, or the Christ Child. According to Joe Perry's Christmas in Germany, A Cultural History, the Christ Child may have been deliberately introduced by the Protestant reformer Martin Luther in an attempt to remove what he saw as pagan elements from Christianity. It's claimed that in 1531, he wrote that, quote, "This is what we do when we teach our children to fast and pray and hang up their stockings that the Christ Child or Saint Nicholas may bring them presents. But if they do not pray, they will get nothing or only a switch and horse apples." Do you want to guess what horse apples are, Cassie? Think of a product that a horse produces.
Oh.
It's horse manure.
Well, that's not very nice.
No. It makes Oliver Cole seem quite good by comparison.
Yeah.
By the 19th century, however, this figure had morphed from simply being a representation of the infant Jesus to being its own distinct folkloric character. This usually took the form of an androgynous-looking child, played by either a young boy or a girl dressed in white, that sometimes also sported wings and a halo. According to Tom German's book, this figure usually arrived to deliver presents when the children were either eating or conveniently already asleep, so, oh no, you just missed them. Though sometimes this figure actually was known to arrive in person in the form of an actor. Outside of this figure, we also have two other groups of less obviously human and more obviously threatening characters. The best description I saw of these was again in Gerry Bowler's book, or Bowler's book, where he described them as, quote, "saggy bogeymen, witches with iron teeth, ghostly figures in white, devils with chains, men clad in fur, straw, and goat skin." These are the creatures that I'm going to collectively refer to as the wild men, and they include figures such as Krampus, Klaubauf, Pelschnickel, or Belschnickel, Knecht Ruprecht, Aschenklaus, Ruklaus, or Ruffklaus, Berkta, or Perkta, Labefana, Schmutzli, and many more. As aptly summarized by Ton German, many of these figures could be aptly described as looking like, quote, "distinctly unjoy versions of St. Nicholas, unshaven and ungroomed men wearing dirty brown cloaks or animal skins and carrying bundles of switches." Some of these figures act either as complete replacements for Nicholas, accomplishing both his goal of rewarding good children and either punishing or even carrying away bad children. Others act as Nicholas's hired muscle, punishing the bad children on his behalf, as presumably it wouldn't do for a saint to engage in such unsaintly activities. So the idea of what a saint could be, the kind of fire and brimstone image of the saint, appears to have changed somewhat during this time. And also in some cases, these characters are quite fluid. Some of them actually do both roles. Sometimes they are the gift-giving figure, sometimes they are the muscle figure. Before we get into a couple of these exact figures, there are some writers that have argued that many of these figures took on aspects of earlier pagan figures that were still present within their local folklore. So, for example, Tom German attempts to extensively argue that many of these figures draw upon pagan roots, and He even entertains the idea that they may have in fact existed and acted in their role as gift givers prior to St. Nicholas ever arriving in Europe. To make this argument, he draws upon the works of two other authors who I would say have pushed this hypothesis about as far as it possibly could go. These are Tony van Rentegem in his work When Santa Was a Shaman, and Phyllis Sijfkes, Santa Claus, Last of the Wild Men. I did have a quick look through Sijfkes' work prior to this episode, and it seemed to me that the arguments that they base these hypotheses on are very flimsy. I don't want to devote a whole episode to my disagreements with this. Basically, the actual real textual evidence that I saw being pointed to was mostly just scattered mentions of priests after the 13th century being accused of different forms of devil worship and the general condemnation of the church of many of these figures. And what I'm not going to dispute, however, is the idea that the creators of these new figures may have been drawing upon some existing folklore at the time when these figures emerged. Because from what we saw in, the Wild Hunt and the Fairies episodes, we know that there are tons of folkloric figures that appeared throughout European history. What has been recorded is probably only a fraction of them. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if these figures are drawn from existing folkloric traditions in different regions, and it may help explain the vast number of different names and guises. My dispute is kind of more purely the idea that these figures could have been, denatured pagan gods and things like that. And also, for the record, all the other works I consulted argue that these figures largely emerged between the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution. We just don't have that many accounts of any of them before then. Now, there are far more of these figures than I can reasonably give descriptions of here, so I've chosen to focus instead on doing a quick roundup of a couple of the more famous. So the first on this list is Krampus, because they're probably the most famous worldwide. Despite being most famous worldwide, I think most people probably only know them as, evil devil version of Santa that's in Germany, I think. This creature is usually depicted as a goat-headed and furry humanoid resembling a devil, who often carries a rattling chain or bell, and whose role is either to beat bad children with a birch stick or to carry them off to his lair in a bag. In some parts of Europe, particularly Germany and Austria, in modern times, people dressed up as this figure will stalk the streets on the night before Saint Nicholas Day, known as Krampusnacht, though thankfully, rather than abducting them, they limit their activities to chasing them and simply poking them with sticks. More family-friendly version.
Yeah, I would be a bit worried if there was officially supported abductions going on in broad daylight.
Another of these figures, who is decidedly less monstrous than Krampus, I wanted to highlight this one because he's kind of on the opposite end of the scale, is the character of Knecht Ruprecht, or Servant Rupert. Unlike some of the Nicholas helpers, Knecht Ruprecht seems to occupy something of a variable role. In some regions, he acts as the principal gift giver, whilst in others, he is a more complementary figure to Saint Nicholas. According to Tom Jerman, Ruprecht is a difficult character to pin down in terms of his attributes. The most consistent thing about him is just his name. His earliest known depictions do show him as a bearded man in a robe and hat with devil-like horns and carrying a bundle of switches and a bag. Elsewhere, he is also described as having fiery eyes and a long red demonic tongue. Tom Jerman argues, though, that over time, these horns would disappear and he would become a less devilish figure. And in his later depictions, he is much more obviously just a guy. In some depictions, instead of wearing a robe and a hat, he is instead dressed in rags or hides, whilst at other times he is covered with soot or chains. I believe the soot often comes from the association of these figures coming down the chimney. Now, it has frequently been stated that his name means the devil, which is a claim that was actually popularized by Jacob Grimm. This claim has been argued against. I personally think it sounds a little bit flimsy. The argument is basically that Ruprecht is similar to the names Rubel and Rupel, which according to him at the time meant the devil. Tom Jerman argues that this might be a Scrooge situation, though, where his name came to mean the devil because he himself is a devil-like character, so it might have come from him rather than the other way around. German also goes into like a long, complicated argument around his name and supposed pagan roots connected to Perchta, which I'm not going to go into here, quite frankly. The earliest depiction of a character under this name is known to come from 1530, from a play, and this character seems to have nothing that we know of to do with St. Nicholas or even with Christmas. According to Jacob Grimm, however, he appeared in a Christmas parade in Nuremberg in 1668, and by the 1680s he was regularly appearing as a companion of either the Christ Child, Saint Nicholas, or of Berchta. In these plays he will show up, threatening to thrash any misbehaving children, to throw them in water, or to puff their eyes out. He is also known to show up at the door during the Christmas season to ask children to pray, and if they did, then he would throw nuts and apples as gifts onto the floor. I also found a good account of his antics that comes to us from the British writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who encountered this figure in a 1798 visit to the village of Ratsburg. This figure wore a white robe, high bushkins or calf-length boots, a huge flax wig, and a mask. On Christmas night, this character would go to every house, claiming that he had been sent by his master Jesus Christ. The adults of the house would receive him respectfully, whilst young children were suitably terrified. He would then inquire of the parents as to how well their children had behaved. If they had been good, he would give them a present, and if not, then he gave their parents a rod and recommended that they use it frequently. So a good description, I think, that summarizes him basically is he's a somewhat scary figure, but he's not really on the level of Krampus. Very briefly, this figure may also have inspired another later character called Belsnickel or Pelsnickel. Many sources I saw colloquially kind of translate this to Furry Nicholas. There is actually a degree of debate as to the origins of this character. It has been argued that he may have had his own. It is argued that he may have been a local creation in parts of the Rhine area, while Stephen Nissenbaum argues in the book The Battle for Christmas that he instead developed from Knecht Rupert. Later, this figure would also migrate to the United States through German immigrants, particularly being known in Philadelphia. So, to give a later example of this, dating from the 19th century, on December 29, 1827, the Philadelphia Gazette wrote that, quote, Mr. Belsnickel is a visible personage. He is the precursor of the jolly old elf, Christkindl, or St. Nicholas, and makes his personal appearance dressed in skins or old clothes, his face black, a bell, a whip, and a pocket full of cakes and nuts. And either the cakes or the whip are bestowed upon those around, as may seem meet to his sable majesty. So as a fun little aside, if you do want to see some great pictures of modern costumes of both some of these and a whole bunch of other European folk characters, I would heartily recommend, as I grope to try and pick up my copy, the book Wilderman, The Image of the Savage by Charles Frege. And it's just a nice little picture book that basically has lots of collected photography of different folkloric costumes from modern day festivals. So you've got the bear/strawman figures, got Perchta in there, going all the way over Europe, the goat figures, which are a very common one throughout Europe. I'm just leafing through pictures to show them to Cassie here, but it's really good.
It's all very interesting listening in. Ooh, nice.
Yeah.
Pictures you can't see.
But I would recommend it. It's a good little book. Outside of these two groups of figures, there are also other figures who, unlike these more, I'm going to say demonic in air quotes, versions of Saint Nicholas or Saint Nicholas Helper, these figures are pretty much just blatant rip-offs of Saint Nicholas. I think most people in the areas they come from would agree that's the case. It was basically to get around the existing prescriptions on Saint Nicholas, is my understanding. These are the Swiss figure of Santa Claus and the Dutch Sinterklaas, or Sinterklaas, sorry, both of whom are presented in bishop's garb and highly resemble Saint Nicholas. Of these two, it is claimed that Sinterklaas in particular may have had some influence on the later depictions of Santa Claus, and as such, I think we should take some time and go into him a little bit more. So Sinterklaas is usually depicted as a bishop, wearing red and white robes, with white hair and a long flowing beard. His earliest depictions consist of woodcuttings, that date from the 8th century, in which he is usually depicted as riding a horse and throwing gifts to crowds of children. In modern times, he is claimed to spend most of the year living in Spain, only visiting once on the 5th of December, which is very conspicuously not Saint Nicholas's Day.
Saint Nicholas's Eve, we call it.
Yes. In more modern times, he now takes a boat to reach the Netherlands, but once he arrives, he typically mounts his trademark white horse. According to Tom German, in preparation for his coming, Dutch children fill their shoes with carrots for Santa Claus's horse, and if they have been good, he fills those shoes with gifts. As with many other depictions, he is also accompanied by a helper who punishes misbehaving children, and who in recent decades has been the focus of some controversy, let's just say. This is Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete. According to Tom German, unlike many other helpers, this figure is practically unknown prior to the 1850s, and he is completely absent from earlier woodcut carvings of Santa Claus dating back to the 18th century. Instead, this association between him and Santa Claus seems to have been solidified by an 1850 children's book titled Saint Nicholas in zijn Knecht, or Saint Nicholas and His Servant. Rather than having devilish features, this character's name supposedly comes from him being depicted usually as wearing all black. Where the controversy comes in, though, is that in modern times, this character is also often depicted in full blackface, with bright red lips and curly black hair that significantly resembles racist minstrel imagery. Now, despite this, and as we'll get into, quite a lot of condemnations of this modern depiction, the Dutch public has broadly kind of supported the continuing use of this figure. There has been a little bit of movement in recent years, but as far as I'm aware, the majority of people still hold this figure to be a non-racist one. One popular argument is that the black colour of this character's face is actually due to soot from peat sliding down chimneys, and often it's pointed to other helper figures having similar soot or ashen appearances. Tom German argues, however, that this claim is almost entirely false, that the claim that this colour is due to soot is a modern invention, and that this character has always consistently been described as coming from North Africa. He's always described as a Moor in earlier accounts. And at the end of the day, the imagery is basically one-to-one with minstrel shows. If you see, I showed you a picture of Cassie before we started this recording, and it's bad.
Very bad. Yeah.
This controversy has since spilled out of the Netherlands. In recent years, organisations such as Facebook, Google, and Amazon have all banned depictions of this character on their platforms. Similarly, the Saint Nicholas Society has called for the blackface version to be retired. I believe that in some places it has in favour of a sooty pit version, which is just like a bit of soot dabbed over the face instead, and for the character to be renamed as just Piet. This controversy personally reminds me a little bit of people in the UK who still kind of hold on to the Gollywog character, claiming that it's not a racist caricature of black people. If I'm being charitable, these people are either ignorant of that doll's history as well, or what we colloquially refer to as liars. As the Gollywog was literally inspired by a stereotypical blackface minstrel doll that Florence Upton owned. I think a big reason a lot of people still kind of hold to these sort of figures that have historical minstrel-esque elements is just because they're part of their childhood nostalgia. They, as kids, did not realise what the implications of these figures were to people who weren't white. And it sucks at the end of the day, like, to grow up with your childhood and think this is an innocent figure of fun for years, to learn, oh no, actually this is bad. It's not fun. Like, I get it. To be empathetic to some of these people.
I can relate.
Yes, exactly.
For reasons you might have figured out earlier in this episode.
Like, I'm trying to extend some empathy to people who hold this position. Like, because I know, like, growing up, things like in the Netherlands, like, Zwarte Piet is still on, like, a lot of products, I'm told, or was until recently. During the childhood of my parents, Gollywog was used in advertising a lot as well.
Even in, like, 2000s comedy, I still remember occasional use of blackface in shows that I did love.
My thoughts on it is, like, you know, I understand people are like, that was part of my childhood. But I think the healthy way to process that is not to hang on to it and insist that everyone else is wrong and it's not racist. but we also like grew up in the era where a lot of like children's entertainers that we thought were really like wholesome figures turned out to not be wholesome.
Yeah.
We understand that like it's not fun having these parts of your childhood be undermined, but like that's not a healthy way to process it, I think, to keep insisting on using these things. So moving hurriedly on from that controversy, sorry for a bit of soapboxing there, folks. It is likely that through a mixture of Dutch traditions around Santa Claus and these Germanic helper figures that the Santa that we are familiar with came to be. This new figure would not develop in Europe, however, but would instead begin his genesis over the pond in America. And you know where most adverts come from these days, Cassie?
Over the pond in America?
Yes. A lot of American adverts, I think almost entirely American adverts on this show from what I've listened to in the past. And enjoy them. And we are back from another typically artful ad transition.
We're doing really great at them this episode.
So we've been going for how long? Our podcast recording says an hour and 50 minutes, but it's probably like an hour and a half of the finished version. We've been going for a while, and that's a long time for Santa Claus to actually show up, isn't it?
Yeah. Practically waiting until New Year's at this point.
It will be Christmas Day before he shows up at the rate of this recording. The good news, though, have you heard the good news, is that he's about to make his first appearances. So according to Oxford Handbook of Christmas and several other of the authors that I consulted for this episode, like one of the claimed histories of how Santa Claus came to be is that his genesis was largely due to the efforts of a small number of authors in New York, which some of you might be aware was originally actually a Dutch settlement called New Amsterdam. I'm going to go through and describe this process first. I want to note, though, there is one author that I consulted who heavily dissents against this view, and I will talk a little bit about the alternative view that he presents as we go. So, to give a bit of background, the colony of New Amsterdam was established in the 17th century, and it appears likely that its original settlers brought some traditions surrounding Saint Nicholas with them. However, the treaty under which the Dutch Republic governed this territory made the Protestant Reformed Church the legal religion, which banned worship of saints and saints' days. Moreover, from the beginning, this colony was by no means limited purely to Dutch settlers. By the end of the 17th century, the city had been taken over by the British and renamed to New York. So by this point, Dutch people made up a very small portion of the city's inhabitants, and as a result, it has been argued that the tradition surrounding Saint Nicholas and Santa Claus may have waned up until the later 18th and particularly the early 19th centuries. According to Judith Flanders, there are a few small signs of continuing traditions surrounding Saint Nicholas in the 18th century. On December 23rd, 1773, Rivington's New York Gazetteer reported that, quote, last Monday, meaning either the 13th or the 20th of December, the anniversary of Saint Nicholas, otherwise named Santa Claus, there's that name dropping finally, was celebrated at Protestant Hall, where a great number of sons of that ancient saint celebrated the day with great joy and festivity. A similar report was repeated the following year, but after that, mentions of Saint Nicholas fall silent. Exactly where this name of Santa Claus came from is uncertain. Judith Flanders argues that this name likely came not from Dutch immigrants in the 17th century, but from German and Swiss immigrants that arrived in New York during the 18th century. Notably, she argues that the Swiss/German Samichlaus and Santa Claus both sound a lot closer to Santa Claus than Sinterklaas does. I mean, that's kind of a debatable point, to be honest, but maybe because I'm not very good at pronouncing these names. This is also a thread that Tom German talks about quite a lot. His opinion, looking at the evidence that's being presented, and I'll go into this a bit more later, he thinks that these like figures brought in by German and Swiss immigrants, like Belsnickel and the Christ Child, are probably more responsible for the actual evolution of Santa Claus than anything to do with Sinterklaas, but I'll get to that. I did find various versions of this story appeared on a large number of websites whilst I was trying to verify it. Interestingly, one of these websites, which is a blog called Boston 1775, claimed that this report was originally published by one Hugh Gain in the New York Gazette, alongside the first reports of the Boston Tea Party breaking out. But again, I found no way to verify any of this. So outside of these possible newspaper accounts, it is claimed by a wide range of historians that the first author whose work helped widely publicize Saint Nicholas in America is someone that listeners might remember from the Flying Dutchman episode. This is the writer Washington Irving. Irving was a member of the New York Historical Society, and it is claimed that he drew upon this history for his 1809 satirical work, A History of New York from the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty. In this satire, Irving contrasted New Amsterdam as coming from a quieter time and place reminiscent of the European Old World, and to emphasize this, he even had it published under a Dutch pseudonym of Dietrich Knickenbacker. Might be the most Dutch name possible.
Yeah, that's just something you come up with when tell ChatGPT make a Dutch name.
Yeah. Yeah, I am Werner von Dutchmanner. Yeah, Van, I should say, rather than von. So Saint Nicholas would appear several times in this work, acting both as a religious figure who extends his protection to various characters and ships, and also as a carved ship's figurehead. Shortly after this, in 1810, the founder of the New York Historical Society, the merchant and philanthropist John Pintard, also produced a woodcut pamphlet that prominently featured an image of Saint Nicholas, along with the following poem in both Dutch and English. Saint Nicholas, good holy man, put on the tabard best you can, go clad there within to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Hispania, where apples bright of Oranje, and likewise those granite surname, roll through the streets all free unclaimed. Saint Nicholas, my dear good friend, to serve you ever was my end. If you will now me something give, I'll serve you ever while I live. Exactly where this poem came from is uncertain. According to Judith Flanders, Pintard claimed it was told to him by an 87-year-old Dutch woman, but it's just as likely that he could have made the whole thing up. We've got no way of validating any of that. This poem would go on to be published in 3 separate New York newspapers in December of that year, and in distributing it, Pintard seems to have had a couple of motives. He clearly wanted to promote New York's early history, but more significantly, it has been claimed that he was attempting to redirect holy festivities towards a pious, goodly figure like Saint Nicholas, and very much away from the more drunken celebrations of the day. In his book, The Battle for Christmas, Stephen Nissenbaum argues that these efforts were part of a wider attempt by social reformers to recast Christmas as a more domestic event, and if this conspiracy, so to speak, did exist, ultimately it succeeded. Everything I just said there sounds all well and good, but there are some problems with it. The first thing I want to point out is that the figure depicted in these works still doesn't really resemble our modern ideas of Santa Claus, or even kind of one of the helper figures supporting St. Nicholas. In Washington Irving's work, he is described as having a low, broad-brimmed hat, a huge pair of Flemish trunk hose, and a long pipe. He does, however, describe him in a somewhat Santa Claus-like guise as someone who rides over the top of trees in a wagon to bring gifts to good children. So that's about as close as we're going to get from that account. By comparison, on Pintard's pamphlet, the saint appears in full bishop's attire, carrying a switch, the bags of gold, and is accompanied by both a beehive and a small dog. As I mentioned, Tom Jerman dissents pretty heavily from the idea that either of these two depictions had a major influence on the later figure of Santa Claus. In his book Santa Claus Worldwide, he points out that the 1809 version of Irving's history does not in fact include these descriptions of St. Nicholas. I had a look for myself. I found the 1809 edition and the 1812 editions. I think the 1809 version was on archive.org. And he's correct. These descriptions actually seem to only have appeared in 1812. In the 1809 version, St. Nicholas is still mentioned, but it's literally just he is mentioned as a figure whose aid is called upon, and that's it. As German points out, there was also nearly a decade lull after this point. There's a couple more stories that came out around this time, a couple more poems. But then after that, there's like a decade where nothing involving St. Nicholas is known of. So I am sympathetic to his argument that perhaps Irving's work was not really the big inspiration point that some historians have claimed if it took us that long to get another account. And when that other big account appears, it's slightly different again. And again, he also disputes it being particularly popular, even if it is very popular today. We'll get into what that is in a second. So 2 weeks after Pintard circulated his poem, the New York Spectator published a similar poem focusing on St. Nicholas's Dutch roots and describing him as bringing gifts of oranges. In 1813, Gerry Bowler and Tom German also claim that we get our first official party pooper in the form of a short work for children titled False Stories Corrected, which would describe old Santa Claus as a foolish children's story. So you might think, someone's already trying to ruin things for everybody. This might be true. I think it's true. I just can't prove it. And the reason is I am currently holding in my hand a reprint of this work, which I thought was the version that they were citing. I only just discovered this morning it's not the same version. It has exactly the same title and covers similar subject matter, but it was published in 1822. I cannot find the 1813 version anywhere. So that could be in there. It's not in the 1822 edition. A decade later, as we said, there was this big lull. We start to again see more depictions of Santa Claus. In 1821, lithographs produced by an unknown hand titled The Children's Friend, a New Year's Present to Little Ones from 5 to 12, includes 3 early images of Santa Claus. This image shows him delivering presents in a green sleigh drawn for the first time by a reindeer. In other images, he fills the stockings of sleeping children, and he is depicted as wearing a furred cap and either a red robe or a red or a green jacket. These prints also included 8 verses that describe Santa Claus acting in his familiar role as a gift giver. It notes, though, that for children who misbehave, he leaves not gifts, but instead a black birchen rod for their parent to beat them with. So we're perhaps still seeing the influence of some of their earlier Germanic figures or helper figures that we discussed before. Then in 1823, an event of what I'm going to call variable importance, depending on who's telling the story of how Santa Claus developed, happened. To me, this is kind of what I'm going to call a, looks like someone just changed culture forever moment, which is that in 1823, an anonymous poem was published in the Sentinel newspaper of Troy, New York, that began with the following lines. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse."
Hey, I know that one.
Yeah. So according to the Oxford Handbook of Christmas, this poem was initially named An Account of a Visit from Saint Nicholas, but very soon afterwards became known as The Night Before Christmas. Now, this poem was published anonymously, and there has since been serious debate as to who its original author was. In 1837, the New York Book of Poetry attributed it to Professor Clement Clark Moore, who would go on to accept authorship and include it in his 1844 collected works. In the last 2 decades, evidence compiled by Professor Don Foster has been used to argue that it was actually written by a completely different author. This is Henry Livingston, who was a Dutch-American author who frequently published poems, engravings, and satirical pieces under a series of pseudonyms in newspapers and magazines prior to his death in 1828. This conclusion seems to have been both supported and disputed by various academics using lots of very fancy linguistic arguments, which I'm really not qualified to assess, so if you're really interested, maybe go and look into that one yourself. Interestingly, Moore is also known to have penned another Christmas-themed poem for his family, which features a much harsher Saint Nicholas who refuses to give his daughter any presents because she cries too much. I think I could tell what he was trying to accomplish there. Regardless of who authored the poem, it is argued by most of the historians I consulted that this hit at basically the perfect time to achieve massive popularity, as Christmas festivities were beginning to be reframed more as family celebrations around the fireplace rather than drunken and feasting affairs. By relocating the date of St. Nicholas's journey to Christmas Eve, Judith Flanders argues that the popularity of this work also gradually destroyed the older 6th of December as a date of popular celebration. When it comes to its actual content, the poem describes what I'd say is a pretty archetypical visit from Santa that we're all familiar with. In it, St. Nicholas is described as a plump and jolly old elf with a white beard and a stump of a pipe who clambers down the chimney and fills the children's stockings with toys. To do this, he arrives in a flying sleigh full of toys drawn by 8 reindeer, now for the first time that I'm aware of, identified under the names of Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder, who later became Donna, and Blitzen. Another minor little fact, in the Sentinel version of the poem, the last two of these names are actually given as Dunder and Bliksem, which could have been a reference to a Dutch phrase meaning thunder or lightning, or it could simply have been a misspelling. There's a whole additional argument that some scholars have made, suggesting that these last two names could be a reference to the Norse god Thor's goats, Nasher and Cracker. Basically just because they're also thunder and lightning, sort of-y. That's the vibe I was getting from those arguments. I've not gone into them because I personally don't think they're very serious.
Another of those, hey, there's a vague connection between names.
Yes.
It must be the same thing.
Yeah. I want to note here that Tom German once again dissents from this view that this poem became widely popular in the immediate aftermath of its publication. Instead, he argues that this poem did not in fact become widely known until it was published nationally in Harper's New Monthly magazine in 1857, and that it only actually reached its real level of popularity that we all know in the form of a later children's book. It is also argued by Adam C. English in the Oxford History of Christmas that this poem introduces some elements of some of the Germanic predecessor helper figures that we discussed before, which are Pelsnicol and Aschenclaus. Specifically in this poem, St. Nicholas is described as being dressed in fur from head to foot, and his clothes are tarnished by ashes and soot. A random thought that came to me is that this might alternatively have just been an artistic detail, possibly. It seems to me like quite a logical extent of Santa Claus goes up and down chimneys a lot. What do chimneys have? Soot and ashes, yeah. So it could be a callback to those figures. It could be an unwittingly similar line of thinking. The crucial element to this poem, as far as I see it, though, is that here Santa is presented for the first time as just a purely jolly figure, with no religious connotations or any cruel elements involving punishing bad children. Gerry Bowler also notes that this image of Santa is, quote, rather proletarian, with his sooty coat and stubby little pipe, and he tries to argue that this is indicative of St. Nicholas being a creation of the lower classes. Again, not really something I've gone that much further into. I thought it was fun to mention. So whilst this poem does bring the image of the modern Santa Claus into something resembling a form that we would recognise, there are still quite a few elements that are missing. Much of this image would be filled in during subsequent decades, during which time the Dutch image of Santa Claus advanced by Irving and Pintard also continued to crop up. So, for example, in 1836, the New York writer and Irving collaborator James K. Paulding published the Book of Saint Nicholas. This work wildly recast the saint, not as an Eastern Mediterranean figure who was born on December the 6th, but as an apprentice baker who was born in Amsterdam on January the 1st. This Nicholas became a respected man in his community, being elected to the office of burgomaster, and eventually he gave his life to save a Protestant man from a Papist mob. So respected was this act that at his funeral, John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism, asked that he be remembered as the good Saint Nicholas, and we are told that his birthday was ever after commemorated with a gift-giving festival. This to me feels like a kind of transparent attempt to convert the Catholic saint into a figure that would be acceptable to Protestant mores. During this time, there were also a couple of competing Christmas-related figures in a different US city, Philadelphia. The more famous of these two was Kris Kringle, the name of which was originally an American corruption of Das Christkindl. As I also mentioned, Belsnickel was also known on the streets of Philadelphia and throughout Pennsylvania at the time. By the 1840s, however, these figures and some of their attributes and names appear to become gradually more attached to the same recognizable figure from the night before Christmas. This is again heavily disputed by Tom German. He argues that actually these Germanic figures are actually the primary influence on the modern Santa, and that Sinterklaas didn't really give anything beyond just the appearance. I think that's kind of reasonable as an argument. I think they did exert some influence. I wouldn't go perhaps as far as he puts the hypothesis. We should also note that during this time, the image of Santa remained somewhat fluid, at least up until the late 1850s. According to Gerry Bowler, in the decades between, he would be presented as, quote, a little N-word, a fearful fire-breathing monster, a young beardless fiddler, and a yeoman farmer in German style. Around this same time, we also see the first appearance of Santa's elves. While Santa had been described as elfin in some of the accounts we've discussed, it is in J.H. Ingram's 1844 novel, Santa Claus, or the Merry King of Christmas, that he is first accompanied by, quote, 10,000 magic riders and musicians bursting out of a single tree on Christmas Eve, none bigger than a thumb. Santa himself is relatively familiar in this tale, having a white beard and being clad in a fur-lined robe, though the robe is purple. He is also described as being tiny, like the elves, but he is slightly taller than them, to mark him out. Then, on December 26, 1857, Harper's Magazine published an illustrated 2-page poem titled The Wonders of Santa Claus. Both the poem and the illustrations describe a Santa Claus that is so close to the modern one, it's almost painful. He's almost there. For the first time, he is described as dwelling in a house of snow somewhere in the Arctic, where legions of elves work to manufacture cakes, sugar plums, and toys to fill up the stockings of good little girls and boys. Santa himself is presented as a white-bearded man wearing furs, a cap and great big boots, and smoking a long pipe. Interestingly though, this version of Santa does not ride in a reindeer-drawn sleigh, and instead, in line with more modern developments, he instead travels by horse, wagon, boat, or, remarkably, hot air balloon. And
why couldn't we have kept that image? That's
yeah,
really cool.
I would like having a festival, where you're going to town and Santa Claus arrives on his hot air balloon. That'd be great.
Santa on a Zeppelin.
Yeah. Oh God. From 1863, this image would be further reinforced and promoted by the illustrator Thomas Nast, whose annual illustrations of Santa Claus would spread him widely throughout the American popular consciousness in the second half of the 19th century. Whilst there are no elves to be found in Nast's images, they generally depict a white-bearded and rotund Santa Claus hard at work making and delivering presents. In one image titled Santa Claus and His Works, he is depicted in his workshop at the new location of Santa Clausville, North Pole. Instead of his furs, he is often depicted in these images wearing a red set of long underwear, I believe what was at the time colloquially called a union suit, along with a large black belt wrapped around his midriff. As Gerry Bowler notes, the union suit did not catch on, but the belt has since gone on to be an integral part of this character. Around the same time that he was developing in America, Santa also crossed the Atlantic to the English upper classes. According to Ronald Hutton, this initial transition can be attributed to another work, the 1854 children's book Kerkkringen, or The Christmas Stocking. However, it would not be until the 1870s that he would come to be widely recognised by the lower classes.
Over this time, he increasingly became acquainted to the older figure of Father Christmas. So, very briefly, Father Christmas was a figure that emerged in England in a similar fashion to the continental Saint Nicholas helpers during the early modern period. Figures personifying Christmas had existed here for many centuries prior to this time. According to Tom Jerman, however, it was the increasing Puritan condemnation of Christmas that led to the full formation of Father Christmas as a character. In the 17th century, this figure would appear in Ben Jonson's play Christmas's Mask under the name of Old Christmas, where he defends the raucous practices of Christmas and criticises the Puritans. This figure continued to be depicted in plays and woodcut prints throughout the century, and came to be depicted as an old man wearing furred robes and a cap, who symbolised moderate enjoyment of excess during the seasonal celebrations. However, this figure would be proscribed, along with other seasonal practices, under the Puritan government, as we described before. Father Christmas would then see a brief resurgence under the Restoration government of Charles II, but it was not until the Victorian period, however, that this figure fully recovered his position. From the 1830s, he would once again begin to be depicted in newspapers and books, where he was usually shown as being either drunk or busy drinking an alcoholic beverage. Interestingly, until his equation with Santa, this figure was almost entirely associated with adult celebrations. From the 1870s onwards, however, he increasingly took on Santa's gift-giving role, and the two figures, I think it's fair to say, slowly became almost interchangeable. In turn, Father Christmas had some influence on Santa's depictions during this time, with him often appearing in Victorian illustrations wearing a hood instead of a fur cap.
By the end of the next decade, Santa had become a firm staple in British pop culture, and he has remained so ever since. But you know what else crossed the Atlantic to the English upper classes, Cassie?
Capitalism?
Well, yes, unfortunately. That's quite a staple of that period of time. But yes, you too can take part in this hallowed Christmas tradition of buying stuff. Here's some adverts. So, after that delightful ad break, we can say that by the late 19th century, Santa Claus was starting to coalesce into his recognisably modern form in the US and in the UK. Far from the sterner figures who inspired him, he was now depicted as a rotund, jolly elf of about human stature, with a white beard, long pipe, and who was usually dressed in red and white furs. He now often was accompanied by his elf helpers, reindeer and sleigh, and as the 20th century dawned, he was occasionally depicted reacting to new inventions such as telephones, automobiles, and biplanes. The idea of writing letters to Santa telling him what you want for Christmas also appears to have originated during this period, as NAS images include him reading huge stacks of children's letters, which I'm pretty certain he will catch up on eventually.
Emails made it so much worse.
Yeah. Now, we are still missing two pieces of the puzzle. The first of these is Mrs. Claus. Throughout earlier American depictions, Santa Claus remained a bachelor, either deliberately or perhaps it was just something that the people who depicted him didn't consider, really. By the 1880s, however, Mrs. Claus, or Mistress Claus, had begun to appear. Initially, she was portrayed simply as a dutiful wife and helper to her husband, one who basically ran the business side of things. In the 1881 story, Mistress Santa Claus, by Margaret Aitinger, she is described as small and plump, with eyes that are brown and bright. According to Gerry, in the 19th and early 20th century, with the increasing push for women's suffrage, authors also began to play with her character. Rather than presenting her simply as a helper satisfied with her lot, Mrs. Claus began to be portrayed in a number of different ways, either as a long-suffering wife, annoyed at being overlooked by society, the true producer of the toys that her husband is given credit for, or as the person who delivered the toys herself after judging that her husband's work was in fact subpar. For example, in 1912, Life magazine would publish a satirical piece called The New Christmas Regime, in which a young boy is woken early on Christmas morning by a noise downstairs. There he encounters not Santa, but instead Mrs. Claus, who declares that she has retired her husband as, due to him being a man, he was limited in his capabilities.
Please tell me that there is a version where they're in the sleigh together and she's like, pull over and ask for directions.
No, I'm not lost. I know exactly where I'm going. The end of this podcast episode. Throughout the same time, Santa's image also began to appear widely in advertising. The exact number of companies that have employed Santa's image since his first appearances is far too myriad for me to try and catalogue here. I imagine you could probably write an encyclopedia on the topic. What I want to do instead is to mention two other common Christmas myths related to advertising that I still occasionally hear come up. The first is that Santa was actually created by the Coca-Cola company in order to help market their products. I think we've shown here this claim is pretty false. Another little myth that sometimes gets thrown around is that Santa's red and white colours actually are derived from the Coca-Cola logo. It is true that he used to be depicted in different colours other than red and white, sometimes throughout the 19th century, but red furs and white trim have popped up in his depictions for decades, predating Coca-Cola. So I am again quite happy to label this a myth. If we're going to get really nitpicky as well, not only are Coca-Cola not the first company to have Santa in their advertising, they're not even the first drink company to use him. That honour instead goes to White Rock Beverages Mineral Water, which used Santa Claus in their advertising for drink mixers between 1923 and 25.
Not Pepsi then.
No. Oh, what a scoop that would have been. I think it would be fair to say, though, that Coca-Cola's use of Santa in their advertising has shaped our perception of both him and Christmas as a whole. I recently lost our personal Christmas challenge, Cassie, as I encountered the familiar refrains of "Holidays are coming."
I've still not seen it yet.
Yeah. And I also lost Whamageddon on the same day.
Not been Whamageddon yet either. I'm going well this year.
So, by the early 20th century, we've now seen the modern version of Santa emerge, during the same time period, the celebration of Christmas became a much more global affair. As noted by Christopher Ferguson in the Oxford Handbook of Christmas, this development was something of an uneven one, with the largest and most influential celebrations still taking place in Europe, North America, and Oceania. This spread was aided by the increasing acceptance of Christmas as simply a pan-Christian holiday, the only major exceptions and holdouts being the groups of Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. It's unsurprising then that with this spread of Christmas, so too did the figure of Santa Claus spread and evolve. I'm shortly going to pass over to you, Cassie, to look at how different cultures around the globe have interpreted Santa, or equivalent figures. Before I do so, though, we're still missing one final piece of the Christmas puzzle. I imagine at this point, a lot of people at home are turning to each other and asking, "Where's Rudolph?" So something I found surprising whilst researching this is that Rudolph is actually a much later addition to the Santa Claus tale. In fact, more than a century would pass between a reindeer appearing in The Children's Friend in 1821 and Rudolph's first appearance. And that's because Rudolph was actually created wholesale by the author Robert L. May for his 1939 children's poem, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which again I think most people are probably going to be quite familiar with in various fashions. Now I had a brief flick through this children's poem prior to this recording, and as anyone familiar with Rudolph might expect, it's very much an ugly duckling story. In it, Rudolph is the 9th and youngest of Santa's reindeer, who is born with a large red and shiny nose, and the other reindeer tease him for it. One Christmas, a thick fog descends, and despite his best efforts, Santa finds himself struggling to make his journey. Eventually he arrives at the home of the reindeer, and finding Rudolph sleeping, he is astonished to see the room lit up by his red nose. Shaking the reindeer awake, Santa asks him to help light his way so that he might finish delivering presents before the children of the world awake. Rudolph was delighted by this, and after leaving a note for his parents, he joins Santa on his voyages. For the rest of the night, he lights Santa's way, and upon returning to his village, all the other reindeer who had teased Rudolph now praise him and want to be his friend, which shows you how superficial reindeer really are.
Yeah, being different will not be tolerated unless it's useful.
Yes. Santa invites the young reindeer to accompany him on future foggy trips, and the story ends with the familiar phrase, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Needless to say, this book proved to be immensely popular, and soon after it began to be adapted into other forms of media. In 1948, a short based on its story was produced by Max Fleischer. Then in 1951, the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was released, which I think many of us are over familiar with at this point. This book would go on to be adapted into many cartoons and films over the next few decades, and Rudolph would soon become a core component of the wider mythology of Santa Claus. Now, keep in mind, all this discussion so far has been the American and the European Santa and his association with Christmas. Now it's time to get a little fun with the idea of Santa Claus, and for that I'm going to hand over to you, Cassie, for our concluding section looking at Santa Claus around the world.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, that was a very thorough history, I think.
Probably too thorough.
As thorough as we could be. So now we're going to wrap things up, pun as always intended, with an overview of some other related traditions. You did specify outside Europe. Some of these will be Scandinavia, part of Europe, rather than southern Western Europe.
Yeah.
Because there's not a lot of information on some things outside of Europe, so I did my best.
Yeah, it's a case of this whole episode is a case of we are doing our best, so don't worry. I'm
going to start by breaking down a couple of popular misconceptions that I've heard in person from various people and seen. One of them I've heard in person from various people, and one I've seen in headlines quoting it, which are from Japan. And given my history of the country, that seemed an appropriate way to start. So, Christmas in Japan, or as it's pronounced in Japanese, Kurismasu, isn't a national holiday like it is in the West. Families will give gifts to their children, and young couples will often celebrate together, but because only 1.5% of the population of Japan are Christian, Christmas never had a religious significance to the vast majority of the country. But if you visit Tokyo in December, it will definitely look a lot like Christmas. If you walk around more commercial areas like Marinochi, Ginza, or Omotesando, you will see some lovely Christmas lights. I'll put some photos on the video version for you, because they are really nice.
Yay.
Many of the malls and department stores have Christmas trees. A lot of stores will have Christmas-themed promotions. The most memorable of those for me is 7-Eleven's Come Come Christmas adverts in 2022.
I think we need a censor bar for that one.
Yeah, we might have to cut that bit. And you will definitely see at least one man dressed as Santa. That man is another famous old man with a white beard, Colonel Sanders. There's quite a few misleading headlines around the internet that say that Colonel Sanders is Santa in Japan. I've heard people misrepresent those claims to mean that Colonel Sanders is the one delivering presents to kids on Christmas Eve, and Google's AI answers will tell you that the Japanese believe that Colonel Sanders is Santa. Because Google AI is brilliant like that.
I had a lot of run-ins with Google AI trying to summarize things that were completely incorrect over the course of this particular episode. I'd recommend not using Google search if you can help it nowadays.
Yeah. There is a way of getting it so it goes just to the old-style Google results and doesn't show the AI.
That's quite good
Stuff.
I'll have to look into that.
Basically, on the list of options, there is one that is just web. You click that and you save that one as your set.
Got handy tutorials on the podcast today as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The articles that Google AI draws those claims from are just clickbaity titles. People who think that Santa and the Colonel are one and the same in Japan have simply read the headline and not the article. Santa was definitely well known enough in Japan long before KFC got involved in Japanese Christmas. He needed to be for KFC's marketing to work. So if you've seen YouTubers like Chris Broad or John Daub, you might have seen their videos on the Japanese tradition of having KFC on Christmas Day as your Christmas dinner. In the 70s, KFC simply saw a marketing opportunity. Supposedly their marketing department had heard the common complaint among American expats that they couldn't get turkey for Christmas and decided to fill the market by promoting a special Christmas chicken meal instead. With KFC already being a popular American import, the promotion also went down very well with the Japanese, and so chicken for Christmas became a popular tradition. Most KFC locations in Japan have always had a plastic Colonel Sanders statue outside, and now he is always dressed up for the occasion as Santa. It was so successful that you have to pre-order your chicken in advance for Christmas Eve or Christmas Day.
Pre-order culture has come for chicken now.
Yes. And it's spread to other independent restaurants and izakaya, which have their own chicken meals and often need pre-ordering. That's what I did for Christmas that year rather than KFC. There is a more traditional figure in Japan who English articles do like to call the Japanese Santa, and which again seems to be a huge misconception. His name in Japanese is Hote, and he is one of the 7 gods of luck, or Shichifuku... I'm usually better than this. Or Shichifukujin in Japanese Buddhism. He is one of the Bodhisattva, a man on the path to enlightenment in Chinese Buddhism, where he is named Budai, and he was a monk in the 10th century. He's usually depicted as a jolly, fat, bald man in an open robe, often reclining and laughing, so he's also known as the Laughing Buddha. He carries a cloth sack, which is where he got his Chinese name of Budai, which means cloth sack. He is usually associated with abundance and prosperity, and in Japanese art he is often depicted entertaining passers-by and sheltering children with an umbrella. The earliest association of him with Santa that I can find is in the first episode of The Simpsons, Simpsons roasting on an open fire. In the episode, kids at Springfield Elementary perform Santas of Many Lands at their Christmas pageant. Ralph Wiggum, the police chief's son, in a robe and a pointy hat and joke shop glasses on the back of his head, announces, complete with this mispronunciation of Christmas, "Merry Kurimatsu, I am Hotsuyoshi, a Japanese priest who acts like Santa Claus. I have eyes in the back of my head, so children better behave when I'm around." There are many articles around the internet, including one from Scientific American, which repeat this claim, although they changed the name to Hosei Osho. None of them provide a source for these claims. I cannot find anywhere covering actual Buddhist belief in Hosei that uses the name Hosei Osho. Can't find any reference to eyes in the back of his head or to gift giving. I can only conclude that Matt Groening made it up after learning of another jolly fat man carrying a sack.
I can also think of, there's another episode, I think it's Homophobia is the name of the episode. It's the one about the character where he finds out the character John is gay and he's like trying to get over his own homophobia. And at one point there is a small robot Santa Claus that I think the character of John claims comes from the moon or something. I think they made that up completely as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's any traditional belief in a robot Santa from the moon, sadly. Would have been interesting for the episode.
Yeah.
To move back to Europe, there's a variant of the Santa Claus stories that Brits and Americans might have heard of, that Santa is not from the North Pole, but from Lapland in Finland. This one is the same Santa of other Western countries, just moved from his more traditional home of the North Pole. It's a bit of a longer standing tradition that can be traced back to one specific person. In 1927, the Finnish radio host Markus Rautio, presenter of Children's Hour with Uncle Marcus, which I won't attempt the Finnish pronunciation of that title. On his show, he said that Joulupukki, a name literally meaning Yule goat, lived in Lapland, on the Kovunturi Fell by the Russian border, on the basis that there he would be able to hear everything, and so know which children were good and which children were bad. The children's author Mauri Kunnas would later take this idea and apply it to Santa Claus in his children's books, having Santa live in a remote village in Lapland with his elves and reindeer. And there are now tourist villages in Lapland which offer touristy things for Christmas to meet Santa.
Yeah, I should have expected that would happen.
Yeah. The name Joulupukki, which was cited in this, was apparently a mixing of the American idea of Santa with a Scandinavian figure named Nuutipukki in Finnish, who allegedly appeared in written sources from the 19th century, although none of these seem to have been translated into English, unfortunately. Right. So, again, like we've said so many times, I can't go back and verify many of these things. From that time onwards, a tradition to mark the end of the Christmas period on St. Nut's Day, January 13th, was for a group of men to wear goat horns, a leather mask, possibly in the shape of a goat's skull, and a large sheep's fleece over the body, and a tail made of twigs.
Yeah, this is sounding familiar.
Yeah, we get a bit more into this, yeah. These men would roam the village, knocking on doors and demanding leftover beer and casserole. Often this would mean drinking only the dregs of the Christmas beer. If they were denied, they would cause a commotion and were said to bring bad luck to the house. I've found one claim that this is descended from a Finnish and Karelian pagan harvest festival called Kekri, Karelian being an ethnic group on the Finnish-Russian border, but I can't find anything to verify that. Alternatively, it may have originated from the Norse pagan ritual of Julebukking, a very similar practice involving going from house to house with a goat's head. Interestingly, if it did begin in the 19th century, that would make it contemporary with the Welsh tradition of the Mythillogical, a tradition which is almost identical, except instead of a group of goats, it's a skeletal horse that's going house to house.
Yeah, I think these like festive parades, so to speak, with these figures, I think they're just like an idea that humans seem to just hit on organically a lot of the time.
Yeah, there are apparently English English parades like this as well.
I'm thinking of things like the Puck Fair and the Puck Goat and stuff like that. Yeah.
I think the general term is wassailing. So yeah, I'm a bit rusty on that word. There's a few other meanings of that word from what I know.
Oh, the Puck Fair is an Irish tradition, by the way, not an English tradition. Just thought I'd say that before the Irish take me out.
Before they declare war on us. So, whatever the origin, Nuutipukki was originally seen as a darker figure than Joulupukki and Santa, and a signal of the end of the Christmas season. The saying went, good Tuomas brought Christmas, and bad Nuutipukki took it away, referring to the season officially beginning on the 21st of December, the name day for the name Tuomas in Finnish Christianity. Joulupukki took on the aspect of going from house to house and punishing those who did not show respect, but instead of taking food and beer, he began giving children Christmas presents instead. He would knock on the door and ask, "Are there any well-behaved children here?" And they would receive gifts if they had been well-behaved. Eventually, he lost his goat-like appearance and became essentially the same as the Santa that we know in America and Western Europe.
The whole thing to me does sound very similar to the German helper figures.
Yeah.
Except he's evolved a little bit.
Yeah. The goat-like image of joulupukki does still show up occasionally in modern Finnish culture. For example, in art by the illustrator Lauri Ahonen, or in the Finnish Christmas comedy horror film Rare Exports. According to Tom Jerman, the Yule goat, as we mentioned before, was roughly contemporary with Nuutipukki, but was more of a fading tradition in the other nations of Scandinavia by the 19th century. In his explanation, which again can't be verified, the Yule goat originated from Tangrisnir and Tanjostir, the two goats who pulled Thor's chariot, before taking on roles in Yule celebrations as Christianity made its way through Scandinavia.
Yeah.
The Museum of Nordic History, instead, on their website, gives the Yule goat the same role as Nuutipukki and the MacLeod, called Julebukking. In this instance, the people dressed as Yule goats may sing Christmas carols and be rewarded with candy, and probably with a hot drink. Some towns apparently had the tradition that with each household, one person must join the Yule goats so that the troop became bigger as they went through the town, which I imagine was limited to smaller towns and neighbourhoods where that would be practical. I've also found a few references to a Christmas prank of sneaking a small straw goat into your friends' houses over the Christmas period for them to find.
That's actually quite fun. I like that.
Yeah.
You get home and open your bag and this little goat pops out.
It sounds like a fun challenge to try. Yeah, go check the rest of your house, Charles.
Yeah.
I found out about this yesterday. I'm not organised enough to have done it.
Imagine getting the phone call, like your friend leaves and they go, "I've left something for you." Like, oh no.
I would dread that.
Then you find a straw goat and you're like, "Oh, actually, this is really good."
Yeah. There is another famous straw goat I should mention. Going into the 20th century, the Yule goat would instead become a public decoration, with many towns building a giant goat from straw in their town centres. The most famous of these is the Gävlebucken, or Gävle goat, which the town of Gävle, Sweden, constructs in Castle Square. This is one of the largest in the country, standing around 13 metres tall each year, and dates back to 1966. In most years since then, someone has attempted to burn it down, which has succeeded 38 times as of 2023.
Yeah, more often than not.
With the last successful burning being in 2022. 2023's goat was destroyed by birds because they used a type of straw that still had seeds in it.
Yeah.
And the birds were hungry.
My favourite story around the Yule goat is the YouTuber Tom Scott did a video on it, and they went there to film it in 2016, I think. And literally within hours of them showing up to film it, it was burned to the ground.
This is not sus at all. Definitely had nothing to do with him.
Yeah. Now, I believe you actually checked the ongoing live stream of the 2024 one, and we can confirm Yule goat still stands.
As of this morning, December 8th, this year's Yule goat still stands. Watch it have been burned in the time since we've been recording.
Yeah. I quite like the Yule goat as a tradition. The only thing which rankles me a little bit about it is that they still prosecute people for trying to set fire to it. And I'm like,
yeah, I think Yule should just sort of get in on this.
Yeah, it's like encourage, make it a challenge or something, like a festive challenge. Like, who can be the one to burn the Yule goat? But I can understand it being a fire hazard.
Yeah,
though,
I mean,
obviously
it's in quite a central space with nothing that could spread around it, as long as it's well fenced off so that there is definitely no way it can spread.
Yeah.
So you have to get a distance away from people before you light it.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those, I can kind of understand, people being worried about health and safety for it, but it's like, oh, come on.
It's fun.
Yeah, the part of my brain that's like, oh, come on, is winning out.
Pretty fire.
Yeah.
After that digression, we'll go back to elves, right? I can't, no way of segueing back easily into that. German just says that as the Yule goat became more associated with this kind of tradition as a standalone decoration rather than a gift giver, elves or gnomes, which were common creatures in Scandinavian folklore became the Christmas gift givers, named Nisse in Denmark and Norway, Tomte in Sweden, and Tontu in Finland, with the prefix Yule added to indicate that the specific elves or gnomes were serving as Christmas gift givers. Outside of Christmas, these elves and gnomes were thought as unseen helpers that were around 2 or 3 feet tall, working at night at house chores in a similar manner to the brownies that we discussed in our fairies episode. Yeah. On Christmas Eve, the tradition was to leave a bowl of warm porridge with butter melting on top for them in the evening as a thank you, and failing to do so angered them and brought bad luck. In 1871, the Swedish artist Jenny Nyström painted images of them with red pointed hats, long white beards, and red robes. In 1881, their association with Christmas gift giving was cemented by the children's book The Christmas Tomten by Victor Rydberg and Harold Weiberg. These also supposedly influenced the Finnish Tomtu, where at Christmas they became the Joltontuja.
It's a good effort.
That one, yeah. I feel like I've been doing so well. Or at least I'd sounded confident with each one until that point.
Confidently wrong if all else fails.
And the Joltontuja wore red hats adorned with bells. And this may be how the more benevolent Santa-like figure reached Finland before merging with Nuutipukki to create the Joulupukki. Iceland, which is also known for its elf folklore, has 13 individual Yule elves who give gifts on the 13 days leading up to Christmas, known as the Yule Lads or Jólasveinar. Outside of gift giving, they don't really bear any resemblance to Santa, but I do want to mention them just because they have funny translated names.
Okay.
I'm not even going to attempt the Icelandic pronunciations, as I have probably already got myself banned from Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway in the past 5 minutes.
We basically can't move outside of like 100-mile radius of England. No.
Japan still accepts me. Japan still accepts me. Their translated names are Gimpy, Gully Imp, Itty Bitty, Pot Scraper, Pot Licker, Bowl Licker, Door Slammer, Yogurt Gobbler, Sausage Snatcher, Window Peeper, Doorway Sniffer, Meat Hooker, and Candle Beggar. They are, as the names imply, mischief makers.
Yes.
With their names describing their particular antics. But on 13 days before Christmas, one will leave each day to go to the surrounding villages, leaving a gift in shoes which are left out on the windowsill by well-behaved children, and a potato in the shoes of any badly behaved children. Which is still not bad. There's nothing wrong with a potato.
You make chips out of potatoes.
Yeah, big fan of potatoes. As Charles can probably tell looking at it. German doesn't provide a source for this, but the Icelandic Embassy to the US website does include articles on Icelandic culture which also describe the Yule Lads, saying they were originally trolls which were used to scare children before becoming more benevolent in the 20th century.
We do need to cover trolls at some point.
Yeah, we'll be on the poll, I think, when we have another creature episode. The next figure I want to talk about is very much a competitor to the American Santa in some ways. Originating in Slavic folklore, the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian Father Frost, or in Russian Ded Moroz or Moroshko, definitely shares some very significant aspects with Santa. One modern statue of him depicts him as a man with a long white beard, taller and slimmer than Santa, wearing a blue fur-lined robe in exactly the same style as Santa, and carrying a staff. Rather than a sleigh pulled by 8 or 9 reindeer, he rides a Russian carriage pulled by a team of 3 horses, called a troika. Cue the Prokofiev piece of the same name from his Lieutenant Kijé suite to play here, which is now also known from its use in Greg Lake's I Believe in Father Christmas. Nice little connection. And my obligatory music reference for the episode. So if we can take a brief journey across the thrice 9 lands to the realm of Russian fairy tales,
here we go.
If you'll remember that callback to Baba Yaga, we find that before becoming associated with Christmas, Father Frost was previously a similar figure to Baba Yaga, Tales of him follow a similar pattern to those that we discussed all the way back in episode 4.
Might actually genuinely be originated from a pagan god, unlike many of the other things that we've talked about.
Yeah. German does talk about some associations with pagan gods, but doesn't find any direct link to the names.
Okay, I just remember reading briefly about that, but it appears on
Yeah.
Yeah.
He mentions a few names. None of them are dead mirage. It is quite possible. Very plausible. We just don't have enough evidence to go on.
Yeah.
Same with Baba Yaga, really. It's very, we said in her episode, very plausible that she was a Slavic pagan god.
Yeah.
Very little to go on to confirm it. So to summarise one of the stories from Old Peter's Russian Tales, a kind, hard-working and beautiful young woman named Martha lives with her old father, her wicked stepmother, and her 2 ugly and horrible stepsisters. The stepmother, of course, hates Martha and abuses her. When she finally decides to get rid of her, she announces that Martha is to be married and tells her to pack her things so her father can take her to meet her groom. Martha thinks her stepmother is finally showing her kindness and is glad to be able to leave and begin her own life. The stepmother tells the father that her husband-to-be is Father Frost, and he is to take her into the woods and leave her there for him. The father is horrified by this, but cannot argue with his wife, and so he takes Martha into the woods and tells her that when her groom arrives, she is to greet him with kind words. As she is shivering in the cold, Father Frost approaches, repeatedly asking her if she is warm enough. Each time, she politely tells him that she is very warm, thank you. Charmed by her politeness, Father Frost takes her in. He gives her the very finest dresses and winter cloaks and jewellery, feeds her a fine meal, and she stays the night in his house. The next day, her father returns to find her quite happy, warm in her new cloak, and with a chest of very fine gifts from Father Frost. He takes her home, and her stepmother is shocked, expecting her to have died. Seeing the gifts, the stepmother gets greedy and tells her own 2 daughters that they shall also be married. She sends them both to meet Father Frost. However, as they shiver in the cold, they begin arguing and insulting each other. As Frost approaches, he asks if they're warm enough, and they're both very rude to him, and he freezes them to death.
That's usually how it goes. I was waiting for that.
Yeah, if you listen to our Baba Yaga episode, that whole story sounds very familiar, I imagine.
It's a very Russian folktale thing of like, it's very much like an early European folktale thing as well, but to be like, oh, and the good person, yes, was very, very nice. We gave them a reward, set them up, do something nice. They're married now. They're happy. The bad person, death.
I think that one set the compressor up.
The bad person, I'll do it again. The bad person, death.
There we go. Yeah, that one would be a jump scale warning for everybody. Yeah, there are a few variants of it where the stepdaughter is sent into the woods on a fool's errand and finds Father Frost's house, or she is sent to ask for something from him, and with the stepmother always expecting her to die in the woods or be killed by Frost.
Yeah.
She proves herself a good, hard-working girl, Frost rewards her, and Frost later punishes the greedy stepsisters.
Yeah. It's also similar to the Baba Yaga thing of like, girl sent off to the Baba Yaga, obviously to get her killed, outwits the Baba Yaga.
Yeah, basically if you remove the marriage aspect, you can just swap out Father Frost for Baba Yaga, and it's exactly the same story. But as Father Frost rewarded the good child and punished greedy ones, you can see where an association with Santa as a gift giver might have begun. He may have took on his more Santa-like image in the 19th century, as the church began to accept him as a more benevolent figure that could be associated with a family Christmas, as suggested by the Express to Russia website talking about the traditions involved. Tom German also says that there is evidence to support this. He cites an article by Val R. Berryman on the history of Christmas in Russia to support this version of Father Frost. He quotes Berryman as saying, "Dead Mirage dates from the late 19th century as a tradition that was borrowed from the West, probably Germany. This borrowed Santa was Russianized by putting him in a troika. He doesn't go down the chimney to deliver gifts, and instead knocks on the door. He is accompanied by his granddaughter, the Snowmaid." I can't find the original source for this quote, and any searches for the article cited only give me Berryman's obituary, so I can't verify it, unfortunately. German also states that Saint Nicholas was still given recognition in winter in Russia, separate to Father Frost, and on Saint Nicholas's Day, children were given chocolates wrapped in gold foil in his name. However, I would call into question Berryman's accuracy on this particular subject, German does also cite Berryman as claiming that an old, ugly Russian witch named Babushka also delivered gifts on the Epiphany, January 6th, to mark the end of the Christmas season. Babushka simply means grandmother or old woman in Russian, but the witch description again calls to mind Baba Yaga, which we did not come across anything relating Baba Yaga to Christmas when researching the episode. The claim was that this was occurring in the 19th century.
Oh, okay.
So I do feel justified in mostly dismissing that claim. The 1902 work by William Francis Dawson, called Christmas, Its Origin and Associations, also doesn't make any mention of Father Frost, Ded Moroz, Morozhka, or Babushka when discussing Russian Christmas. Whether or not Father Frost was seen as a gift giver in the 19th century, after the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks banned Christmas as a Western festival, and so got rid of any depictions of Saint Nicholas, Santa, Father Frost, or any Christmas figures that may have existed at the time. However, around 1935, the Soviet Union introduced the New Year's festival and introduced, or reintroduced, Father Frost as its gift giver. This time, he was also accompanied by a daughter or a granddaughter, Snegorochka, the Snow Maiden. The earliest appearance of her was in the play The Snow Maiden, written by Alexander Ostrovsky and scored by Tchaikovsky.
Oh, wow.
Here, she is the daughter of Father Frost and of Spring the Beauty, and yearns for the companionship of a human man. However, her cold heart cannot feel love. Her mother, taking pity on her, grants her the ability to feel love. However, as she falls in love with a young shepherd, her heart warms and she sadly melts. The 20th century Father Frost and Snegorochka were both greatly patriotic and were said to live near the village of Veliki Ustyug in the Volgoda region north of Moscow. Today, a grand wooden house has been built there as a tourist attraction. There's definitely some Western influence here. He has a post office next door to receive letters from children and a large workshop where toys are made. Families can visit, meet him, and watch the toy-making process, and take troika rides through the surrounding woods. Snegorochka at some point moved out, and in the town of Kostroma, where Ostrovsky lived, is the site of her own house. Hers is more traditional than her father's, and children there can learn traditional Russian crafts with her. In the 2000s, as a way of promoting international relations, Russia has staged meetings between Father Frost and various countries' Santa Clauses, particularly Finland and Estonia, to promote cross-border relations. As of 2009, Russia's counterpart to NORAD, GLONASS, has been tracking Father Frost on New Year's Eve.
We're also concerned about him being a threat.
Yeah. The name Father Frost or Grandfather Frost, depending on the translation, is claimed in various articles online to also be a figure from the mythology of Turkic cultures of the Eurasian steppes, most commonly called Ayaz Ata in the Uzbek language. However, all my attempts to verify this led me to a Turkish academic who said he has found no evidence that this figure has any roots in Turkic mythology and seems to be a modern invention from social media to essentially create a Turkish Santa Claus, which is quite ironic considering Saint Nicholas's origins on the southern coast of what's now Turkey. So we've gone full circle a bit there. We're at the point where research that section just goes deeper and deeper into unverifiable claims and rabbit holes leading nowhere. So I feel that's a fitting place to bid Merry Christmas to all and to all good night and disappear back up the chimney.
Indeed. Before we do that, of course, we tend to give a bit of a hint what our next episode is potentially going to be. So,
I mean, how many times have we said, oh, we're going to Ireland? All episode, we've mentioned it multiple times.
Yes. We're going to be making a stop off to Ireland, going back to the reputed Iron Age of Ireland, to look at one of Ireland's most famous heroic figures and an associated cycleness around them. I'll leave you guessing as to which exact one I'm talking about. There are a couple. People on Patreon who saw the vote already know which one.
And we're going to have fun pronouncing everything.
Yes, it's going to be a complete disaster. We're going to try and learn some Irish pronunciation for it because I can't see any way around that.
I've got a list for names. I'm getting the hang of names.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this podcast, folks, you can always follow you can follow me on social media. I know Cassie doesn't really have public-facing social media, but you can find me on Blue Sky. I've basically abandoned Twitter at this point, just as the Histocrat. If you want to support this channel a bit further, you can always go to patreon.com/thehistocrat. And if you're listening to this on Spotify, there is also a video version that can be found over on YouTube on the same Histocrat channel. And if you want to listen to this podcast out and about on the go, rather than watching the video version, we can be found in all good places where podcasts are found.
Did you forget the word podcast there?
No, I just realised that we didn't actually say that we're the podcast Mythillogical at the beginning of this entire thing.
Oh yeah, we're Mythillogical, guys.
Yeah, great move. Hello, folks. Well, it looks like we're starting another episode now then. So,
Not again.
On that note, to all a Merry Christmas and to all a good night.
Close enough.
Close enough.